Hello, and welcome. I am Chilling Tales. And as you get ready for bed, you must know that you are doing amazing and you deserve all the sleep you can get. So as you are winding down, let me know where you are from and what time you are watching this video. Like and subscribe to help the channel if you'd like. Now put your mind at ease and let the story unfold. My mother used to say there are two kinds of underground: the kind people make because they're proud of themselves, and the kind the ground makes because it's tired of us. She learned that from her grandmother, who cleaned the crypt steps under St. Isidore's, where the candles sweat into the stone, and the air remembers names better than people do. Down there we speak soft, my mother would tell me, and we put things back where we found them. Down there we never ring bells we didn't hang. It was a bedtime warning wrapped in folklore, something about the undertaker of Halcyon, Brierly's old name, a man who loved his ledger so much that he began adding the living to it, keeping their shoes in pairs to count how many feet a household owed the dark. I didn't think about any of that when my car battery died in the municipal lot, and I decided to cut across the abandoned rail yard. I was thinking about the 40-page zoning addendum waiting on my desk, a vending machine sandwich that tasted like its own wrapper, and the way grief turns every errand into a series of doors you forgot you had to open. Mostly, I was thinking about time. The long way around would add half an hour to an evening already too long, and the chain-link fence at the lot's edge sagged where everyone always pretended not to crawl under. I ducked, stepped into weeds glittering with broken glass, and told myself that if I slipped a boot between the old rails and followed them through the low cut under the hill, I would meet the main road in minutes. The smell hit first: rust, wet creosote, a sweetness like a storage room opened after too many summers. Crickets chirped with the thin confidence of things not paid enough to sing properly. The moon made the rails look almost cared for. Beyond the yard, the hill's dark shoulder rose. A culvert should have been there, one of the shoulder-height concrete pipes the city capped when teenagers turned them into drainage graffiti museums. Instead, there was a mouth. It wasn't a culvert, it wasn't even honest masonry. The entrance leaned into the hill as if the hill had learned how to smile too wide. The arch was ringed with black streaks that didn't look like soot so much as the residue of something that had licked the stone clean and left the taste behind. I hesitated while the old stories stepped out of the past, like relatives who can't be ignored. Shoes in pairs at the foot of beds, bells that hum when you aren't listening, the undertaker's ledger, too heavy to keep upstairs. Two kinds of underground, I heard my mother say, but the shortcut felt like a promise I'd already agreed to, and so I went in. The temperature drop was immediate and complete, a hand over a candle. My ears popped, sound gathered in the tunnel, and began to behave like it had rules of its own. Gravel muttered under my boots. I raised my phone, and the flashlight pushed 10 feet of honesty into a dark that seemed comfortable without it. On the wall, graffiti glared back, faces, eyes, a sentence scratched until the stone itself looked scabbed. Mold climbed in strange anatomies, long fingers, arched spines, something like antlers. A cricket behind me chirped once, apologized in silence, and left the conversation. Somewhere ahead, something scraped the stone with a deliberation rats don't have. I turned to leave. The mouth was gone, not turned, not hidden, gone. Where there had been an arch there was wall, unhelpfully solid under my splayed fingers. The rails behind me seemed to sink into the rock like bad memory. I aimed my beam at blank stone until I could taste my own panic. Okay, I said to whatever counts as mercy underground. Okay, forward then. The tunnel sloped like a decision people make for you. Shallow recesses showed in the walls, the first two the size of closets, the next deep enough to be rooms that had changed their minds. In one recess lay a porcelain doll with a crack like lightning from mouth to ear. In another, a miner's helmet with its carbide lamp, pried off, a mildew-green ring where sweat had been, and then the shoes appeared. Pairs, men's steel toes, women's pumps with their tips worn spare, children's sneakers that once would have lit at every step, all set toe-to-toe with a care so precise, the care itself was a cruelty. I thought of my brother lining his sockets on the rail, smallest to largest, so that morning wouldn't punish him for what night forgot. I thought of the undertaker's ledger making a house heavy. The scrape returned, closer, then paused, listening. The air changed taste. Antiseptic long used, paper stored improperly, wet fur. I moved the light, and the beam felt thinner, as if the dark were a dense thing, and not a lack. The alcoves leaned toward me. I remembered my mother's trick for halls that think they own you. Name where you are. Briarly, I said softly. Rail yard. Municipal lot. The words fell and became nothing more than sounds a mouth had made. The tunnel widened into a room that wasn't a room because no one had been brave enough to call it one. Rails split in three. The center line ducked into a pool, so black it looked painted. The right-hand line lifted into a platform tiled with old ambition, its safety stripe a ghost of caution. On the wall above, letters that damp had rewritten, spelled Halcyon, the name Briarly used to wear when it still believed in civic miracles. I climbed because elevation makes cowards honest. Benches stood where backs had hated them and learned to be grateful. On one sat a single shoe. Its mate lay on the tile, toe touching toe. They were cleaner than anything else down here. A doorway gaped into what had been an office in an era when offices were still polite. A desk, a chair angled like a person had stood up expecting to sit again. A lamp, sedimentary layers of paper. A map hung on the far wall. Glass cracked across continents, color faded to funeral china. It showed a city like ours, and not like ours, pierced with lines and oxblood, mustard, and an untrustworthy blue. Halcyon Subterranean Passage Authority, the legend said, and in the corner someone had penciled notes. Soil types, water table, bedrock. One word underlined 3 times, voids. Something shifted across the doorway behind me. I turned with the slow economy of a person who knows the difference between moving and running. The beam found a shape in the cutout across the platform. It wasn't theatrical. Nightmare drawings do too much. This was precise in the way moss is precise when it decides to be architecture. A back made of ropes under wet canvas, ridges like bones that had reluctantly agreed to be bones. Front limbs bent the wrong way for any elbow that wanted to last. Ends that were not hands but had learned the motions hands do. A head that rose carefully like the neck had only just been invented. When the mouth opened, it wasn't for threat. It was as if it were trying out the fit of a word and finding the measure wanting. As for eyes, if you need them, call the 2 deep panels of reflection eyes. But understand, you have already begun to lie to yourself. It moved not toward me, but along the bench line, 3 measures to the single shoe, a tremble from limb to end to shoe, a tilt that corrected what I had been too scared to fix. Toe found toe. Okay now. It withdrew as if embarrassed by the demonstration. A sound came from its chest that was not a hiss and not a purr. It was the breath people make when they look at a baby and try not to startle it. Then it unmade its edges. It's the only way to say it. It didn't leap or duck. It let go of its outline, and the space it had been learned how to be empty again. In the office, the map looked like it had remembered a name it didn't want to know. On the desk, a folder with a spine, softened by fingers, waited the way a wrong book waits to be opened. I opened it. Black and white photographs frowned up at me in the flat old way. Men in hats around a trench that wasn't a trench but a cut into something that didn't want to be called Earth. Another image showed a bell the height of a knee rising on chains from a place that did not admit directions. Its surface looked slick even without a shine. Notes in tidy script, acoustic anomalies during lift, recommend suspension. A second hand had added in pencil, do not ring. A soft, wet scrubbing reached my ears. I followed it down a corridor, narrower than honesty, stenciled numbers sweating from the paint. Someone had scratched Helpay at knee height, and someone else had written under it, don't answer, and the two hands had been patient with each other. The hall opened into a chamber whose walls had been licked into curves. In the center, an arrangement waited, shoes in pairs nested in rings, laces tucked into their throats, helmets at measured intervals as if guarding, lunch pails with their handles threaded as if holding hands. In the very middle, 9 copper bells no bigger than a palm, their bellies stamped with fish whose eyes convinced you and then didn't, if you kept looking. 2 creatures stood by the bells. The larger held itself between the arrangement and the door, with the posture of a person who knows the exit and will use it on your behalf if you behave. The smaller leaned in, an end laid lightly over the bells, as if a parent's hand were on a fever. The bells hummed, not from a strike, but from being named by contact. The note gathered in my jaw and went down my spine like a memory I didn't earn. A seam opened in the wall behind them. That's what it was. Skin admitting a line. It had been hiding. A figure leaned within it, half in, half out. Green municipal jacket, hair flattened by the habit of not wanting to take up space. Eyes open with the floating focus of someone almost out of anesthesia. Eddie, I said, not because I recognized him from the missing poster stapled to the bulletin board at work, though I did, but because the name belonged to the angle of his head. He blinked, and the blink took longer than blink should. Tell my mother I had my shoes on, he said. He gave me the sort of smile men keep for when they can't afford to frighten anyone. Come out, I said, because telling people to do impossible things is how we prove we care. The seam tightened to the width of a hand and paused like a polite throat. The larger creature shifted half a degree, ridges along its back rising in a slow wave. The smaller pressed the bells gently. They answered with a note so low it made me aware of bones I'd never properly considered. I backed away to the platform and didn't run, because running is how you teach certain hungers your shape. The pool under the center rail broke one bubble like a perfect eye, and then remembered water. In the alcoves, the doll rolled a quarter-inch as if settling in. When the wall finally gave way to night, it did so with the weary indifference of a clerk stamping a form. I sat on the curb with my knees apart and my hands dangling like nobody's business, and watched the fence remember its plain duty. Across the lot, the municipal complex glowed with that odd faith buildings have in the business conducted inside them. A bar down the block emptied a handful of laughter into the street. I wanted to call my mother. I wanted her to tell me not to be a fool, and to be a fool anyway. Instead, I went home, put my shoes side by side under the chair the way she taught me, and slept badly while the radiator translated for ghosts. I didn't go back the next day. The tunnel mouth was gone again, Hill shrugging its coat closed, and I felt both hurt and forgiven. On the third day, I found it waiting at lunchtime, a clean black line drawn on the hill where nobody had sharpened a pencil. I brought rope because my brother believed in rope, a pen light because men like to pretend we have enough light, and a length of brass pipe from my trunk because I had decided names were weapons. Inside, the office map had grown another crack north along the oxblood line, as if someone had taken a dull pencil to the plaster underneath. The single shoe on the bench had migrated an inch to nuzzle its mate more neatly. The chamber with the bells smelled like antiseptic, turned friendly by long use. The seam stayed shut. The larger creature waited the way dogs wait outside bathrooms. The smaller rested its end on the bells like an oath. I can trade, I said, my voice absurdly formal in that room. Air for a name for a way. The larger unrolled a length of hose and set a glass bottle on the tile. It was the rude, beautiful kind used on the old condensate traps downstairs. Warm, the brass cap turned under its own intent. Inside, air had a shape, a small motion, a curl that looked like it wanted out without knowing why. I lifted it to my ear. A woman's voice looped inside, singing a word the way you sing a child to sleep. Not English. Then it pivoted and I recognized the syllables. Delilah, Catherine from Custodial, is not a woman you make cry, but she cried when I said the name in her ear in the doorway of the janitorial office, because she had listened to Eddie's mother talk to every photograph she owned and could not stand the way a woman's name can get misremembered by a city that writes it wrong in a field on a form. We walked to Delilah's apartment with the bottle in my pocket like contraband and said her name in the right shape of breath, and she put her hand over her mouth, and then over my hand, and then over Catherine's shoulder, and when she had cried the part that needed to be cried, she gave us cookies, because she's the kind of woman who will feed whoever brings her a piece of her own life. That night the seam was open enough for a man to step through if he had decided that patience was the better part of bravery. Eddie's hand appeared first. Catherine took it like an oath. The wall gave him up as if reluctant to admit generosity. He stepped onto our side with his shoes on, laces tucked neatly in a way that made me want to laugh until I slept. Tell her I wore them, he said again, and when he smiled this time there was less of apology in it and more of a hush. You would think that would be the end of the kind of story men like to buy me drinks to ask me to tell. It wasn't. The trades continued, not nightly but like weather systems that roll through when pressure changes. A bottle left at the threshold, a laugh or a nickname or a word breathed into it like a bird rescued from a chimney and returned to sky. A small change in the building as payment. Elevators that stop overshooting by one floor, a radiator that learns English again, the courthouse lobby doors that decide not to hum at 2 in the morning. The city noticed the wrong thing, as it always does. Fresh air usage is high, a consultant said, as if that were a moral failing. They capped the roof relief to optimize flows with a white paper that read like a prayer to prophet. By midnight, the building's breath had thickened to the pitch of a song I did not want to hear. The lobby's columns gathered their corners into throats. The glass in the fixtures sang one long, deliberate note like a tuning fork, deciding to be. I went up in rain and spun the relief wheel until the hinge screamed, and the wind pushed my hat to the parapet and returned it like a guilty friend. The air loosened. The lights remembered they were only lights. In the morning there was a slate mortared into the seam, where the brickwork never quite consents to stay. Do not ring, scratched with a nail, and beneath it, in a smaller hand, keep the air. I wish I could tell you I never heard the bells ring. One night, when summer had pried open every window in the city and wouldn't close them, the bells made a sound that wasn't a sound. It moved through my jaw and folded the bones behind my ears like paper. The smaller creature flinched. The larger set its weight, as if to receive an impact I could not see. The seam pulsed. A deep, slow answer came from somewhere farther down, like a building turning over in sleep. Don't, I said, not as a command, as a plea. The note unwound the way stitches give. The bells sat quietly, as if offended by their own temptation. That should have been the last time I saw temper in that room. But hunger and order are cousins that fight like brothers in a backyard. The next Tuesday, the municipal complex's power glitched, and the elevators forgot which direction mattered. I followed a ribbon of LED light down to the sump, where the room had been wearing a mouth all week. The shoes at the threshold were polished like a rebuke. Inside, the smaller creature had curled around the bells and would not move when the larger leaned. The bottle on the tile was hot, almost to pain. I unscrewed the cap with my shirt hem over my palm. Nothing came out. No voice, no laugh, no word, just a quiet the size of a chapel. I carried it up and held it under the relief vent anyway. The quiet slid out and went up, and the building exhaled like a parent who has stopped listening for a cough and started listening for sleep. I stood there, my throat hurting with nothing, and realized what I was, a courier of air between a creature that arranges what we drop and a building that pays attention too hard. I was not a hero. I was maintenance. That knowledge would have been enough to keep me obedient if the Undertaker of Halcyon hadn't decided to count me in small ways. The first morning I woke with my boots side by side under the chair, toes touching, laces tucked in. I blamed myself for being neat in my sleep. The second morning, I woke to find my coffee mugs paired on the counter handles, meeting like hands, and I set them apart and laughed to hear myself apologize out loud. The third morning, there was a third coin between two coins I had left unpaired out of spite, a thin copper piece stamped with a fish where a president should have been. I carried it to the fence at the yard and slid it under to the place where weeds grow shortest, and when I looked back from the sidewalk, I could see a bare patch that looked like a hand had been resting there, waiting to accept what I offered. You want a climax, you want blood, or you want the moment when I lose the rest of my life to someone else's story. I can give you the moment I almost rang the bells. The city awarded a contract to a new startup to automate the air, and their app turned the relief vent into a number on a screen someone miles away could flick as if they were dimming a lamp in their living room. The night they tested it, the doors bowed, the columns made throats again, and the building's breath gathered into a single hard-held note. Down in the chamber, the smaller creature pressed its limb to the bells and froze like a child, keeping a promise with all their might. The larger rolled the seam back with its body and took one careful step into the door, like a father choosing to stand between a road and a curious son. I reached for the bells not because I wanted to call anything, but because a part of me had learned wrong, that ringing is action and silence is surrender. My fingers hovered an inch above copper that should have been cold and wasn't. I felt the Undertaker's ledger open to a page with my house on it. I felt the room consider how my name would look stacked above my brother's. I let my hand down and unlaced my boots instead. It sounds foolish to say this, I unpaired things. I set one bell a half-inch off the neat 9. I turned one helmet askew. I crooked the laces on one pair of shoes and left the loops long like tongues. I took 2 lunch pails from the ring of hands and set them apart with their handles not touching. The room breathed in offended and then out, considering I said soft and stupid as a ritual. Not like that. The bells stilled, the pressure in my skull eased by one thread. The larger looked at me, not with eyes but with the attention of something that knows how to survive, then repositioned one bell back into the 9, as if to say, I accept your refusal, but do not embarrass me. I opened the vent on the roof with both hands until the rain ran down my sleeves like absolution. If there is an ending, it is this. The hill still learns and unlearns a mouth. Shoes still wait at thresholds with their laces tucked, and I still set them apart when I have to. Bottles still warm my palm and empty into sky. The slate still says do not ring, and the smaller hand beneath it still says keep the air. The map in the office shows new cracks sometimes along lines no one will fund. Catherine still walks the halls like a woman whose job is to clean Mercy off tile and put it back on. Mornings, Victor still tells me there is no tunnel, only a culvert that has seen too many teenagers. Delilah sometimes brings me cookies, the kind with the crosshatch of a fork on top, because that's how she was taught to say thank you to men who do what they can and know better than to do what they can't. Sometimes, when I wake at 3 and the radiator is practicing a language I cannot speak, the room shifts around me as if furniture has tides. I put my bare feet on the floor and feel the building's breath come up through it like a dog pressing its head into your hand. I let it be. I put things back where I found them. I leave a coin when I pass the fence, because you have to pay the undertaker something, or he will come upstairs to collect, and upstairs is not where he knows how to behave. On work days, I walk through the lobby and say out loud and under my breath, "Not here," when the doors think about bowing, and they straighten themselves out like a shirt tugged by a friend. And on certain nights when summer won't quit, and the courthouse lights keep their glassy watch, and the hill thinks about smiling, I stand at the edge of the yard and smell paper and antiseptic and fur, and I feel the invisible rings under the water open and close, once like a throat, swallowing a name, and I say my own under my breath, each syllable in order, so that when the ledger opens, the line for me remains mine to write. I won't tell you it's noble. It isn't. It's work, keeping air moving, unpairing what shouldn't be paired, pairing what must be, carrying a bottle to a vent, because the ground below us built a room out of our leftovers and needs us to keep its manners. You can make a religion out of anything you do, often enough at midnight. I have this. I don't ring bells. I didn't hang. I don't answer what I didn't call. I don't keep what comes from under. And when the creature at the center of it all nudges a shoe a fraction with its careful end and looks toward me as if to check whether the world is aligned, I nod, and it nods, or maybe the ridges along its back find a new low, and we keep the air between us clean, the only way two kinds of underground can manage, by knowing which of us counts and which of us remembers, which of us opens, which of us refuses, and how often we must trade in silence to keep the ledger closed. Now, on to the next story. I learned the sound of the forest before I learned its language. It's not the same thing. The sound is what gets written on Green Ranger forms. Wind through crowns, stream on stone, two-note sweep of an osprey, a pickup grumbling 7 miles away. The language is what gets passed behind the counter in a thermos, written on a scrap of brown paper, folded once. There's something wrong on the north face. Don't camp under the blue wall. After a dry August, if you hear your name in the evening, you make yourself busy. I took the seasonal post at Burnt Top Lookout because moving up and away felt like peeling a bit of grief sticker off the inside of my skull. I told my supervisor I needed altitude. I didn't tell her that the night before my interview, I'd slept on the floor next to my brother's toolbox, trying to remember which wrench he used when our sink sang. The tower was 90 feet of creaking staircase and a glass room with a map table in the center, 8 windows, 2 bunks that could become benches with the right kind of stubbornness, a cast iron stove, a radio that made feelings out of weather. If you've never worked a mountain, you might think the best part is the view. That's wrong. It's the intimacy, tree by tree, notch by notch, the way clouds mean rain, or don't, depending on whether they lift their hems when they pass a certain ridge. You come to know the horizon the way you know a face you used to love. Even when it looks different, it's the same. Our ranger district kept traditions like some families keep recipes. We were required to carry a whistle, but told not to use it unless we wanted the wrong ears. We were told to not read surveyor's tape in threes on the north side of a tree if we had to step off a trail after dusk, and to untie our own knots before noon the next day. Someone else would untie them if we didn't come back, but that would be a pity. We were told to carry a small bag of salt and a silver coin, not because we believed, but because belief has a way of borrowing the right pockets. In the watch log, a thick ledger for the tower, older than any of us, someone had copied onto the inside cover a paragraph in a careful hand. There are callings in this forest. Some belong to people, some do not. If you are called by name in a voice you know between the last light and the first, respond in the voice of your work. Say lookout to dispatch, even if your radio is off. Say wind shift to 12 o'clock, Even if the air is still, they won't follow you into that language. I laughed at that. I laughed the way you do when you've already planned to do the thing you're being warned not to. It took me a month to write the paragraph into my memory with the same respect as the weather codes. Late July, the heat made a mirage out of distance. The valleys breathed smoke from fires 50 miles south, and it got into everything: my oatmeal, my hair, the shirt I wore to sleep. I woke from a dream where my brother was teaching me to tie a bowline and couldn't remember whether it was the rabbit around the tree or the tree around the rabbit. That afternoon, I put my boots in the shade under the cot to soften the leather and read the incident reports blazing a polite orange on my phone until the service faded to a slow drip. At dusk, a herd of elk moved like thoughts down the eastern meadow. At dusk, the first voice called me by name. It came from the west slope below the tower, where the balsam and hemlock make a dark that looks permanent, even at noon. I was filling the blue jug at the cistern and almost didn't mark it. Maya, it said, in my brother's voice, as if he hadn't gone quiet under an engine, as if he were calling me in for dinner from 3 houses down. It wasn't the exact timbre, it was the fact of him in my mouth, moving out through my teeth like a hot spoon. Look out to dispatch, I said, like an idiot. My radio was off. I set the jug down, and the lid tinked the stone, and I thought, if I imagine this, then I invented it, and if I invented it, then I owe it time. The wind shifted to nothing. Top. The second call came from closer, farther upslope, which is not how sound should travel. My brain didn't endorse it, and my body didn't care. Top. You see that smoke? East of Trout Notch. It was Wes's voice, Wes from the West Unit, who hummed Springsteen off-key and called everyone by their position, as if the day were a chessboard he wanted to unfurl. The map on my table had a thumbprint smudge on Trout Notch, where we liked to pretend we had fixed the world. There was no smoke rising from it. The ridge between us and it lay clean and dumb. Look out to dispatch, I repeated and turned my radio on this time. It hissed like a lake before rain. Wind shift to 12 o'clock. My voice sounded obedient and small. The voice tried again, just once, my brother saying my name with a plea inside it like wet rope. Then there was only stomata breath from leaves, and somewhere a nuthatch making an old door noise at a snag. I wrote the date and the phenomenon in the log like a ranger, left a dot of salt on the sill like a child, ate dinner with my boots on like a person who had decided rules could be prayers. If the story is going to earn your time, it needs thresholds. The second threshold was a whistle I didn't blow. 2 days later, the heat broke. Fog came in and made all the shapes polite. I did my routine anyway: binocular sweep, angle of the shadows, condition of the steel cable on the tower's west guy line. When I came down the last run of stairs, a new row of cairns waited beside the bottom step, 3 stacks of 3 stones each, precise enough to make a surveyor sigh. The stones were local, river-rounded, lifted from the creek bed a half-mile north. They still remembered the varnish of old water. Ranger humor, I thought. Hazel from the East crew liked to unnerve trainees. She once tucked a dozen pine cones under my cot and then radioed, "Cones fall where they're needed." I knocked one cairn over with my toe, because that's what you do when you don't want to be owned by someone else's joke. I carried the stones back to the creek because that's what you do when you've learned not to leave proof. At dusk, someone rebuilt the cairns and added a 4th stack. The 4th leaned. It leaned the way a person leans when they are testing if you will put a hand on them to make them upright. It leaned toward the west slope, toward the dark inside the firs. A voice came from there, low as a fresh burn, and used the exact way my brother had said my name the first time he taught me how to bleed a radiator. I didn't answer. I stood there with my hand on the railing until my fingers learned nothing is actually steady. At midnight, the cairns toppled on their own. At dawn, a circle of powdered soil ringed the base of the tower, like something had pushed fingertips into the dust and drawn the pad of itself around me. The third threshold was a dead radio and a living fire. We'd had dry lightning. It moves across a line of peaks like someone rolling a zipper, striking at places the map has nicknames for: Devil's Tongue, Blue Wall, Widow's Thumb. The storm had run out of water 2 days before and gone to bother another state, but that's not what lightning respects. I caught a faint column down in the draw east of Trout Notch, a whisper of gray, and radioed it in. Dispatch asked for a size up. I gave them the right words: single tree torching, slope 30%, fuels mixed conifer with cheatgrass. That's what I saw. What I didn't say: the smoke rose and then paused like breath, then rode a loop in the air and put itself back in place. There's ways to explain that. Thermals, a fluke of wind, or you can decide you won't be taught something by a phenomenon you don't respect. We sent a crew. We had to. Rules, even the ones that can't save you, are better than guessing. I heard the chopper before I saw it. Up valley, a dragonfly that didn't believe in grace, hauling red buckets like second thoughts. On the highway 7,000 feet and 3 ridges away, I watched 2 engines antline past the bend where the cliffs still remember werewolves from cowboy movies. I tracked them in the mirror, compass marking a slow bucket depression toward the draw. The first radio call came as the chopper hovered, rotors stomping the canopy into submission. Dispatch, this is Helitack 6. We have eyes on the column, and can you confirm ground? A beat. 2. The woman at the board had been on longer than any of us. Helitack 6, go ahead. Yeah, I've got. The pilot's voice clipped. I've got no heat signature. I still have visual on smoke. No heat. I'm going to make a pass. Down on the highway, the engines made lights where no one could see them. The crew boss called in their turn onto the spur road, and the taste of dust came up through my tongue as if the line between our bodies had betrayed me. The pilot made another pass with the FLIR and swore softly into his mic because his instrument cluster knew him and knew he wasn't prone to superstition. Negative heat. We're going to set down at Trout and reassess. The first engine's brakes squealed in the switchback like fear. I interned with those crews once. I know what an engine brake means. In my binoculars, I watched men and a woman. We've all eaten terrible burritos with check straps, shoulder ash packs, go to their little green gods for a safe, and then one man, Ephraim, whose kid draws fire engines like dragons, stop, hold his hand in the air, cock his head. He turned to face the furs. He nodded like someone had explained a thing, and then like a sane man, he looked up at my tower to see if I had understood it with him. From the west slope below my feet, a voice called, sweet as a beer at shift change. Ephraim. Ephraim took 3 steps toward where I would have taken 3. The crew boss put a hand on his shoulder and said something I couldn't hear. Ephraim shook himself like a dog after rain. I swallowed my voice. They cut a line around a fire that was a smoke that was a promise without a flame, and for 2 hours did work that keeps men alive and is sometimes purely symbolic. At sunset, the smoke looped itself like a thought and went out. The crew drank water in the notch and ate something that had the right caloric balance and felt heavier than it deserved. Ephraim untied his boot and poured out a pebble. In the empty space under my tower, someone who knew my name arranged 5 stones into a run that pointed like a compass needle at the trees. After that, we stopped pretending. Hazel came up with 3 days' food and the kind of smile that only shows up when you've already had to decide whether you think someone is stupid or brave. She had 2 ancient traditions in her pack and no patience for the modern ones. One tradition was a single bell, small and wrong for calling cattle or children. It had fish stamped around its little bronze belly and a split across the lip where someone who didn't know better had rung it too hard. We don't ring what we didn't hang, I said, quoting the log. We don't, she agreed, but I want you to know I brought it, and I want you to know I know better. The second tradition was older. Hazel set a small linen pouch on my map table and unrolled it so the four corners lay to the compass. Inside was something I had never seen on paper and had only heard described with the reverence reserved for recipes that half a town believes will bring a dead person to the door if you make them right. A wrapping of hair and twigs bound with nettle and thread. The loop of it knotted 3 times with something that looked like sinew and wished it wasn't. My grandmother made this, Hazel said. She called them borrowers. Her grandmother called them something in a language I'd disrespect if I tried. They borrow the shape of a voice to get you to take one step off your line. Some are harmless, some barter, some are just hungry for the pair your feet make. If you don't go when they call, they follow. If you blow a whistle, they answer with their own teeth. If you play an instrument, they watch your hands until they can do what hands do. They hate knots. They love repetition. They'll put anything in pairs, and they can't stand it if you speak in work. In work. The language, she said, gesturing out of the windows at what was trying to be a world. The part of you that's verbs. That's why the notes in the log say to call for wind shift when they call you by name. They can have a man's voice. They can't say 10-hour brush assignment without bleeding. Tie this around the leg of the map table and don't untie it. And Maya. We hadn't said my name out loud until then. Hearing it made me feel like I'd tripped and landed on childhood. Yeah, when you have to step off a trail after dark, and you will, talk about what you're doing like a prayer. Right foot, north foot, 2 steps, brush, snag. If you run out of nouns, make them up. Don't give them adjectives. They eat those. Is this a test? I said. It's a job, Hazel said, and grinned without teeth. They came the next night. Not one, many. Voices like the rack of a shed lying in leaves and deciding to stand. They didn't try my brother again. They had learned something about me and were polite enough to acknowledge it. They used Wes until I could hear the smile tucked behind his call, and then they used a voice so kind I didn't have to remember who it belonged to in order to obey it. Top, it said. We've got Browning north of the old scar. You seeing that? It would have been nothing to pick up the binoculars, to step to the rail. It would have been nothing to say affirm and give them the lever. I did what Hazel had told me. Look out to dispatch, I said. Wind shift to 12. Slope 30%. Brush manzanita. Fuel load liar. It felt ridiculous to say liar into a radio that didn't care about my metaphors. The calling paused. For 3 heartbeats, the entire hillside held its dear breath. Then, right under my tower, something set 2 stones together and pressed them into the powder until the powder made a halo around their twins. I slept in my boots. Morning didn't make it better. Morning just made it brighter. The cairns were back, careful and ridiculous, and a braid of manzanita lay on my bottom step, tied in the same knots as Hazel's bundle around my table leg. I left the braid where it sat because not interacting is a form of interaction, and I wanted to save stupid braveries for when they mattered. Around noon, a family in matching hats that said "Bring back the Lynx" hiked up the far trail, sweating good honest sweat, talking in a loop about how the youngest was drinking enough water. Is the tower open? They asked with faces that assumed the world would be kind. I told them we'd closed it to the public for the week due to maintenance. I told them if they saw a pile of stones, they should take pleasure in kicking them. They laughed like I was eccentric and kept going. They didn't come back. We found them at dusk below the blue wall, where the creek braids, and the cheat grass pretends to be a carpet fit for camping. We found the father first because the father was heavy enough to keep his place. He lay at the base of a fir with his eyes open, as if looking at a bird a long way up. The boy was 30 feet downslope, folded as if by love into a cradle of roots. The mother lay beyond the boy with her hands in fists, as if she had wanted to punch the sky and had only remembered how to hold on. None of them had a mark. Their shoes were off, the laces tucked with a care that made me nauseous, the pairs set neat. 5 small cairns circled the father's head. They might have looked beautiful from above if you were the kind of thing that likes patterns. We did the work that comes with that. I spoke in the voice of my work, words for maps and methods and the numbers you say because you have to say something you can live with. The hello came again, the one with the tender pilot who refuses to dramatize his voice into a version other men can worship. He took them away in the basket, and I didn't hear names, because names would have made me choose a corner in my body to sit in and cry. After the rotor wash had lifted the grief from the meadow and flung it at the brush until the brush wore it, I saw the boy's hat in the fork of the manzanita. When I picked it up, 2 small stones fell out of the crown, a pair side by side weeping dust. I don't know what you want from me next. The right story would have me march down the slope with Hazel's bell and do a foolish, effective thing. The true story has a leaner hero. The next morning, the smoke from the south settled into the draws and did paperwork on our lungs. Dispatch rerouted our engines and our crews to help counties with less luck. Hazel gave me half her coffee and told me her grandmother used to leave a bowl of milk on a stump for borrowers, and that when they came in the morning, the milk would be thick and blue and smell like the sinus of a wave. We don't do that here, she said. But if you see a circle of powdered soil that isn't wind, you don't step inside it unless you want to be told stories you weren't ready for. I promised not to, because I am a good liar. That night, I followed a sound a sane person wouldn't. It was too late for daylight and too early for anything else. My watch said 11, which meant nothing to the trees. The call began as the clatter of deer hooves on basalt. It turned at the big snag where the woodpeckers teach their children percussion. It slowed by the spring where the old pipes still fussed under the mud. It was Wes for a little while, and then my boss from the shop floor at the mill I had worked at the year my brother left for Idaho. When it became my mother, I showed my boot soles to the sky and went back up the steps like I had been called for dinner for the last time. By the 3rd step, the voice inside the voice gave up. I think about that sometimes, the little sigh inside the work a thing is doing, when the work doesn't feed it. I closed the hatch, and I tied a knot, and I sat on the floor and put one hand on the map table and one hand over my throat, and I said, "Look out to dispatch. Wind shift to 12. Brush lie. Manzanita liar. Ridge, your mother." Hazel laughed asleep on the bench and said my name from the underside of her tongue, and my brother answered inside my jaw with the little tick of a wrench that has found the right notch. There are callings in a forest that are only the memory of a thing trying to stay alive. If you feed them, they come back with better manners. If you starve them, they walk the line between the trees and practice their steps until you give them something else to do. On the 7th day after the family in matching hats left their shoes neat as a sin, the wind went weird. It spun the smoke like thread and drew a line of it toward the west slope, toward the place the voices like to teach themselves. It smelled like antiseptic and wet paper and a wool sweater that has been left damp in a bag. The floor of the tower throbbed like the undernote of a bell not rung. Hazel sat up and said very evenly, "Okay." She has a way of ending a life with that word that doesn't actually require choosing death. She untied the little bundle from the table leg and tucked it under her shirt and put the knot bell in her pocket. "You'll burn me if it goes wrong," she said. "I'm not a person who finds jokes funny when they are true. I'll come with you," I said. "No," she said more gently than I deserved. "You will call my position, and you will speak in a work that the borrowers can't mimic, and you will make them stand still. If I'm still standing at dawn, I'll tell you why we don't ring it, which you already know." We went down the tower stairs. The night had the wrong number of stars. Somewhere south of us, a tree fell without having the decency to make noise. Hazel walked the way women do when they've decided fatigue is a thing they'll pay for later. I called our position on the hour and the half hour, and whenever my breath got ambitious, "On spur from top to west," I said, "passing snag, brush manzanita, snag carpenter ant, Pileated owl at 9 o'clock, who would prefer not to be relevant. Wind shift to 12. Hazel didn't speak. She held the bundle under her shirt with both hands, and when we reached the edge of the trees, she turned to me like a friend who will not allow pity in a room with work, and said, "Turn around." I didn't. That's on me. I went as far as the first fir, and then I stopped and put my shoulder against it, as if we had invented column and arch for a reason. Hazel walked into the dark under the boughs and stood in the circle I hadn't stepped into. It was powdered soil with its grains aligned so precisely you could have told me the wind had done it, and I would have turned away. The air on my face tried to decide whether to be cold. Hazel wrapped the hair and twigs and nettle into a tighter knot than any hand I have has ever made, and placed it at the circle's center, and the ground sighed like a secret. The voices came up around us like a slick and did not touch her. "Look out to dispatch," I said, because I am obedient when I know nothing else to be. Wind shift to 12. Human at West Circle. Knots at work. Knots at work. The fur under my palm tried to lean. My hand told it no. The knot bell jumped in Hazel's pocket. Even in that wrong light, I could see the fish stamped around its belly strain toward the notch in its lip. She took it out and held it by the hoop, and the forest changed its mind about where to put its feet. Not the trees, something under them, under the dirt, under the work the dirt had done to become dirt. "We don't ring what we didn't hang," I said, like a person pleading with a god to whom prayers are jokes. Hazel did not ring it. She held it just high enough for the night to see, and the night bent around it like glass around sugar. The voices made one noise, not to us, not to each other, a note that made my ribs feel like numbers. The circle pulsed. Hazel set the bell down instead of letting it pull itself elsewhere, and said in a voice of somebody checking a fire door, "My grandmother said you like pears. I have 2 hands. I will keep them both if you don't bite me." A pair of stones rolled out of the dark and set themselves together at her toes. Hazel laughed, low and mean. "That's not a trade," she said. "That's counting." With the sort of pride that makes people dangerous, the forest put 2 more stones next to those. Hazel reached down, picked up one, and threw it hard into the dark, where it struck something that made a sound between water and fur. Then very gently, she kicked the other 3 apart. The circle sighed again, less like a secret and more like a bed. "I'm going to start a story here," she said, "and this part I can't recount as if language is a thing that should act like prose." She spoke in work. She told the ground about the watch schedule and how the blue jug must be filled at the cistern at noon. She told it about the angle of our tower's shadow at 4 and the way the stairs complain at the second landing. She told it about the smell of the stove when oats boil over, about the 2 clicks the radio makes when it's about to give dispatch a migraine, about the splinter in the 7th stair that once got a man named Gary in the thigh and put him on desk duty and turned him kind. She told the ground a recipe for coffee we only make when we are very tired and still mean, and with every odd verb, the powder of the circle rearranged itself like fur in rain. She didn't say color, she didn't say fear, she didn't say beautiful, even when the light tried to make her say it. The voices tried my brother again, like a child peeking between fingers, and for the first time, the little grudge at the base of my skull folded sleepy. The bell on the ground vibrated, the way a coin does when you spin it and stop it with your whole palm. Hazel kept talking. Inside my mouth, my body counted vertebrae, in order like a rosary, and then it was done. Not over, not solved. The circle stopped pretending it had demands. The bell went still. Something far down the slope placed 2 more stones at the root of a fir and was satisfied with the neatness. We walked back up, Hazel 30 years older than when she had walked down. "What did you trade?" I asked when we got to the first landing. "I told a story about work," she said. "I took adjectives away from something that eats them. I left it verbs. I left it the bell on purpose, because it's not ours, and if it goes somewhere else, Maybe no one will try to hang it. It will come back, I said, because the ground likes being told its own habits. Yes, she said, and sat on the floor and leaned her head against the map table leg and went to sleep before she hit it. In the morning, a wind carried the smoke south like a teacher ushering an unruly class to a bus. The helo took supplies and came back with a sick joke of a ham sandwich. Wes radioed that he had seen lights on the North Ridge at midnight and had not gone to meet them because he had responsibilities, and he is a vain man and likes to say sentences like that. The little knot bell was gone. In its place lay a coin, copper and thin as sin, with a fish stamped where authority belongs. I slid it into the pocket with my salt. I wrote in the log, as if logs prove anything. Perhaps you want the part where the forest remembers a loss and decides to honor mine. That is too clean for us and not honest to trees. What I want is the part of the night in which voices say the names of the parts of a tower. The stairs tell me when I've forgotten to use my knees. The stove calls me liar when I say I cannot make a better breakfast. The map says where it hurts to be folded too often on the crease between the notch and the ridge. The circle in the woods is still there if you know where to look. Powdered soil aligned in a pattern that means nothing until it means wanting. I do not step into it. I step wide. Sometimes, when the hour is wrong for human company, a line of 3 cairns waits at the bottom step, as if someone brought me the old ideas with a new bow. I kick them over. Sometimes the borrowers bring me a braid of manzanita that has learned how to tie itself and lay it on the step like an apology. I leave it until noon, then carry it to the far stump and let the birds use it for beds. Once, only once, I woke to find my boots aligned under the cot, laces tucked like a mother. I moved them apart, made them messy, said out loud to the floor, "Not like that." Near the end of the season, a tourist climbed the wrong sentry ridge and went missing. We found his pack with his phone still at 40% and a podcast whispering to the cheatgrass about how to become better. He had followed his own voice into a draw that wasn't on any trail and sat down under a fir and unlaced his shoes. The soles of his feet were dusty and clean, his socks rolled into pairs, placed neat. He was breathing. We shook him and he woke and looked at us like we had interrupted a math problem he had been about to solve. We told him to put his shoes on. We didn't say why. He did. On my last night in the tower before the snow closed the trail like the lid on a cake, I made oats and burned them and ate them anyway because forgiveness is a kind of hunger people practice differently at altitude. The radio murmured a winter storm advisory. The windows breathed until the glass wore my breath like a loan. Outside, the west slope made dark that felt like a hand cupped over a match. Someone called my name the way my brother had when he wanted me to witness a thing he had built. He said it once, with the wrong hope. I said, "Look out to dispatch, wind shift to 12, top secure." The leaves pressed their mouths together like cousins at a funeral. The night made a new priority. I went to sleep with my boots not quite side by side. In the morning, I put a coin under the first step and another under my tongue, and when I went down to lock the hatch, I found the circle had written itself again and refused to be important. On the road out, the ruts were the rightful owners of my attention. The sky had remembered how to be sincere winter. At the blue wall where the creek braids and the cheatgrass pretends not to know better, I stopped and listened, the way you do when you've been taught a language you're not sure you want to keep speaking. The forest made its little noises, nuthatch, creek mouth, branch shrugging itself free of a burden not asked for. Far in the firs, something set 2 stones together and left them alone. I drove away without counting them. I carried the coin in my pocket above my salt. I didn't ring anything. I keep it that way. The first time I took the sleep tech job at Mercy East, I told myself I was doing it for the quiet. Overnight shifts sounded like penance I could live with. Unhooking sensors, pouring decaf, making notes while monitors breathed their little electric sighs. The hospital had been closing one wing at a time for years, selling off equipment like old furniture, and the sleep lab was all that remained on the 5th floor. It used to be pediatrics. If you peeled the soundproofing off the walls in room 2, You could still see cartoon whales floating through paint the color of fever dreams. My supervisor, a hawk-eyed respiratory therapist named Iris, met me in the elevator with 2 clipboards and a packet of peppermint tea. "It's dead up there," she said. "You'll like it. Just don't go past the double doors at the end of the hall." "Construction?" I asked, because hospitals always have a reason to say no. "Decommissioned," she said. "They sealed it when they moved neonatal to the West Campus. The negative pressure fans still kick on in the middle of the night. Power's snaked from a sub-panel that doesn't remember it got retired. It sounds like breathing. If you hear it, ignore it. If you think you hear crying, definitely ignore it." "What about if I hear my name?" She looked at me for a beat like I'd skipped ahead in the training and spoiled her favorite quiz. "Use the radio," she said. "Use the voice of your work." It was the same instruction my mother gave me before I moved out after my brother died. If something calls you out of sleep in a voice you can't place, get up and count your shoes. If there are more or fewer than the number you own, wake the house. Mercy East's 5th floor had the feel of a room that knows the party ended last night. The linoleum remembered shoes. The glass remembered names on tape on doors. The sleep lab occupied 4 rooms and a narrow monitoring station set in the crook of the hall, with a low desk and 3 rolling chairs that refused to go straight. We had 6 beds, 2 working CPAPs, a closet full of electrodes, and a coffee machine that made Mercy taste like powdered milk. I had 2 patients my first night, a trucker who called himself Mike like it was an agreement, and a woman in her 60s named Arlene, who wore bright lipstick and a cardigan, the color of the fluorescent humming. Mike snored the way a man breathes when he's convinced the world will keep running without him. Arlene lay on her side, as still as a promise, and held her hands clasped against her chest, like a person who had spent a lifetime waiting to be good. I set the leads on their scalps and wrists, and watched the monitors bloom into lines. EEG, EOG, EMG, airflow, thoracic and abdominal effort, different languages writing the same poem. During lights out, I tucked myself into the monitoring station with a blanket I'd folded into squares, the way my brother used to fold maps. The hallway beyond the lab ran in a straight shot to the double doors Iris had warned me about. Someone had taped a faded stop sign across them, the kind with a cartoon hand in the middle, palm raised, a smile below it, for children too brave for their own good. At 1:14 a.m., Mike's oxygen dipped like a courtesy bow. I turned up his pressure and watched the line correct itself. At 2:03, Arlene's REM started, the faint, rapid eye movements like windshields in rain. Sometime around 3, the building sighed. The negative pressure fans in the sealed wing kicked on, and the double doors flexed inward and settled and flexed again, as if someone behind them had leaned forward to listen. The radio at my elbow crackled with the sound of air trying to be a sentence. "5th to Central," I said. "Audio anomaly at 5 East. Checking status." A voice I didn't recognize answered with too many consonants. "Copy anomaly." The static peeled away like old paint. The building exhaled. At 3:13, the hallway lights warmed. I hadn't touched the panel. Beyond the double doors, faintly, as if from a room down a road, a bell chimed. It wasn't a crisp tone. It was a metal sound softened by cloth, as if the bell had been wrapped and struck anyway. A nurse once told me the neonatal unit had kept a little bell by the incubators for emergencies, the kind you'd ring when you didn't want to alarm the parents but needed the room to notice. "Don't go past the doors," Iris had said. She hadn't said, "Don't look." I walked down the hall, my shoes whispering to linoleum. The double doors had little rectangular windows set at adult eye level. I went to my knees like a person who has learned humility in cheap apartments and looked through the metal-framed glass at a length of hallway more empty than the part I was on. The lights farther down flickered with the leisurely rhythm of old fluorescent tubes. Beyond them, at the next intersection, something moved past, too tall, too careful. I went back to the station and sat because sitting can be a verb you use to reclaim a room. The ECG beeps arced their patient pulses. The building held its breath and let it go. At 3:27, Arlene's EEG did a thing I hadn't seen in training. 3 clean spikes, like a hand tapping a glass. Then a flatness that wasn't quite flattening. Then a rise, as if something had called her name from an angle that her sleep owed attention. Iris wasn't answering the radio. The line buzzed with the deliberate pretense of competence. I looked at the door to room 2. Arlene lay where she had lain, hands clasped, hair netted in leads. Her lips moved around a word, or a breath, or a habit. The paper on her pillowcase had wrinkled in a perfect line where her head had dragged when she turned half an inch, and the crease looked like writing. Something tapped the glass of the double doors. Not loudly, the way a person knocks when they don't want to wake the wrong sleeper. I told myself it was thermal contraction, old metal in the building's lungs. Something tapped again, softer. I tried the voice of my work, 5th to Central, door anomaly, 5 East, neonatal wing, visual of motion beyond, request status. No answer, only the fans rising. The air smelled sweet with the sweetness you get from paper left wet too long, and under that, the medical antiseptic that lives where names are written on bands and stuck to wrists. I went to the doors. This time I didn't kneel. There's a point where dignity feels like a talisman, and you polish it by not bending. Through the little window, I watched a length of hallway that had learned silence the way people learn languages and marriages, by repetition, by compromise. Somewhere down the hall a bell chimed. I could see the cord faintly, hanging across the intersection like an artery. Someone pulled it in that careful way that makes objects behave. The bell chimed again, soft as if wrapped and rung. In room 2, Arlene's REM line looked like the heart rate of a person who had finally allowed themselves to cry. I stepped away from the doors and went to her. "You're okay," I said in a voice I hoped would convince us both. Her eyes moved behind their lids like she was looking at something she couldn't afford. A tear slid out and caught the tape at her temple. The bell chimed a 3rd time, a little harder, metal remembering itself. The double doors flexed. A draft moved down the hall and slid under my sleeves. I smelled milk. It was old and not cruel, like a song someone hummed in the wrong key on purpose. Central to 5th, the radio hissed and corrected itself. Status check. 5th, I said, grateful for the part where I got to be a professional. 2 patients stable. Possible door failure 5 East. Audio stimuli from decommissioned wing. What kind of stimuli? The voice asked. It sounded like a man who had been told not to smoke for 20 years and had decided on cigars instead. A bell, I said, like neonatal. A pause long enough to hold a decision. Copy, don't engage. That should have been the end of the first night. I should have kept my chair in its bailiwick and watched lines become lines. The building, though, had learned my footsteps. The 5th floor has a particular echo when you walk carefully. The sound comes back to meet you a second sooner than it should, as if parts of the corridor are closer than they appear. Someone stepped outside the double doors and waited. That's what it felt like, as if a person had put their hand on the jamb on the far side, out of sight, and leaned so their weight made the center of the door bow. When I took the sleep tech job, Iris had handed me 2 things, not on any inventory, a little pouch of salt and a silver coin. The janitors used to leave salt lines when they waxed, she said, as if the statement connected. If you feel stupid using them, that's fine. Feeling stupid is cheaper than feeling wrong. I walked to the doors with the coin warm in my pocket. I could feel the vibration through the metal where a palm pressed from the other side. Don't, I said, because the word fits in so many mouths, and the pressure eased like a favor. The bell on the far side chimed again, not a command, an invitation. It would be easy to believe in harmless hauntings in a building that has already taken your tax dollars. The pediatric wails under the soundproofing would encourage you to soften the edges. I went back to the station and set the coin on the desk. It made a dull click like a ring in a far-off room found its finger. Arlene murmured a name. It wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone I knew. She had never said a word during intake. She said Miriam like a prayer undone. When my shift ended at 7, Dawn had already taught the windows how to be dutiful. I turned my patients over to the day tech, who asked about the coffee and not the doors, because asking about doors obligates a person to keep not opening them. Outside, the parking lot put its brave face on for the day. The cars early, brave, responsible. I drove home with a flavor of milk in my throat and slept until my apartment forgot what I looked like. The second night, I had 3 patients, because words travel differently when there's not much else to do. A college boy named Devin, pale and chatty in the way of people who have learned to argue with their own symptoms. A woman named Sally, who wouldn't say what she did for work, but had the posture of a person who has held doors open for too long. And Mike again, bleary and apologetic, eyes red from a route running too hard through too many nights. Iris met me in the elevator and handed me a little bell on a red string. "No," I said. "Right," she said, and put it back in her pocket. "But I want you to know. I brought it, and I want you to know. I know better." "What happened to the neonatal bell?" I asked. "It's sealed in a box in Central Supply," she said. "We put a sticker on it that says Dio not ring. Sometimes we hear it anyway." At 1:08, Devin's EEG wrote a restless sentence and then coughed in the middle. At 2:21, one of Mike's effort belts slipped because he had turned and taken the line with him, and I went in and retaped it, and he said "Thanks, Gloria" in his sleep, which told me somebody kind had once saved his life. At 2:57, the double doors flexed inward again, like a person breathing in preparation. The bell chimed, rapped and struck. "Central to 5th, the radio said, not quite asking. I didn't answer. There's a thing you learn on nights. The difference between a call you should take and a call that will teach the wrong person what your voice sounds like when it's lonely. In room 3, Sally's eyes darted behind their closed lids like birds deciding if the air was honest. Her fingers tapped against the sheet in threes. Tip, tip, rest. Tip, tip, rest. That rhythm gets into a person. It makes you think you can keep time with it, and then it confesses it is not a tempo you were built to hold. She whispered, "No, no, no," like someone practicing a polite refusal. The bell chimed again. The doors flexed. The air moved along the floor and over my shoes like a dog testing your patience. Through the little window in the left-hand door, a light flickered far down the hall. It was the sort of flicker fluorescent tubes learn when the ballast is dying. It had cadence, the kind that convinces you it's a code you will eventually be invited to break. I did the thing that would either save me or set me up for belief I couldn't afford. I uncoiled a line of salt from the pouch and shook a little ridge across the threshold of the double doors, heel to heel. Then I set the silver coin in the center of the line. The doors bowed and eased, as if considering whether coin counted as kindness. The bell chimed once more, with a little impatience. I went back and sat, and an hour passed in the kind of silence that is owed, not earned. At 3:37, the hospital shifted. The elevator down the hall opened and stayed open. The motor didn't hum. The light inside the car made a room like the inside of a shell. I've never liked that elevator, old, with a little rattle, as if a bead were trapped inside the wall. The door stayed open, inviting. In my periphery, something went by, tall, careful, the way tall, careful things move when they know they're being watched. It crossed the far intersection, stopped, adjusted itself, and proceeded. I realized with cold embarrassment that I had been nodding at it any time it passed for the last hour, as if 30 years of other jobs had built a reflex in me to greet colleagues even when I didn't recognize them. I got up and walked toward room 3 because wanting to be in the presence of a person is a compulsion that has kept worse creatures away. Sally's REM had ended. She lay perfectly still. I watched her chest rise and fall and counted 14, 14, 14. Her fingers had stopped tapping. Then she smiled, the kind of smile people make when a story they've been telling themselves decides to give them a good ending. Miriam, she said, and the monitors wrote a syncopation like someone had tried to imitate a lullaby and gotten the math wrong. Back at the double doors, the salt ridge was just as I'd left it. The coin had turned a quarter turn and sunk into the salt like a foot in snow. The wrapped bell chimed again, sharper, as if the cloth had been pulled back and the metal had found part of itself that missed being loud. Central to fifth, the radio insisted. Answer. Fifth, I said. Monitoring. No intervention. Status unchanged. Silence then. Copy. I could have told you a different story and ended it there. Another night intact. A set of lines printed. A coin turned back upright on a desk, with hands I could call mine. But at 4:14 a.m., Mike sat up. He did it with an economy of motion you don't see in people who have been tangled in wires all night. His eyes were open to a distance that wasn't room for. I have to go, he said, and disconnected himself with practiced fingers. He stood and walked out into the hall, and I followed, because in most jobs, when a patient walks, you walk too. Mike, I said, soft like speaking to a sleepwalker on a ledge. Hey, hang on. We're still recording. I have to go, he repeated, not frustrated, just committed. He stepped up to the double doors and stopped at the salt line, like a polite guest. He looked down at the coin as if he had never seen money and didn't trust the concept. His lips moved around a name I couldn't catch. He raised his foot. Mike, I said again, and my voice did a thing I didn't know was in it. I stood between him and the doors and put my hand on his chest and said in the voice of my work, we're at 4:14 hours. Apnea events at 6. Desats minimal with correction. Lights out at 22:30. Documentation incomplete. He looked at me like I'd just set a coffee down in the perfect place by his elbow. He blinked. He blinked again. He took a breath and the breath hit the tape at his cheek, and he winced the way people wince when they realize they've been made to behave in ways too old for them. Sorry, he said, embarrassed for having lent himself to somebody else's plan. Didn't mean to. He gestured at the doors, at the coin, at the salt. Do a thing. It's all right, I said. We'll finish recording. He lay back down. He didn't disconnect anything, and he didn't apologize again. He slept the kind of sleep you only get after you've agreed to abide by the rules of a place you don't live. At 5:03, the bell chimed 4 times in quick succession, impatient like a nurse who has been too kind for too long. I sat very still. At the handoff, Iris took one look at me and pushed a paper cup into my hand. You look like you danced and 2 different people stepped, she said. What's behind the doors? I asked because using the voice of work sometimes earns confessions. The real story. She tilted her head as if she were adjusting an oxygen mask. There are stories that need a room, she said. That wing has more of them than most. Neonatal's the one they admit. There was also a sleep study for infants before they decided that subjecting new parents to wires was poor form. Apnea monitors, oxygen lines, metronomes to cue breathing. They put a tiny bell on the crib when they wanted to check a reflex. They rang it softly so only the baby would hear. And sometimes the bell rings back, I said. Sometimes the bell rings where there isn't a bell, she said. And sometimes something else rings when the bell does. You should take a night off. I didn't. When an instrument has found your note, stepping away doesn't teach it to play different songs. It just makes it learn how loud it has to be when you come back. I slept, my apartment putting itself around me like a coat. I dreamed about the pediatric whales under the soundproofing, their painted eyes looking at me through the scrim of foam, patient as people who have listened to crying long enough to know the differences. The third night began with a storm, not dramatic, just rain practicing an old piece against the windows, gutters reminded of their job. Iris signed me in and gave me a flashlight that had never been tested on a real night. If the power drops, she said, the doors will default to closed. If someone is in the elevator, they'll send maintenance up. Your job is to keep the monitors writing until I can get you a generator. Don't. She stopped herself from finishing the sentence. You know. I know, I said. At 12:41, the lights went. The emergency strips along the baseboards glowed. The monitors stuttered and corrected. The rain sharpened until each drop sounded like a finger tapping plastic. The elevator doors down the hall opened and closed, the motor not playing its note. The bell beyond the double doors chimed with the precision of a metronome that had found an apprentice. The doors flexed inward and outward steadily, a lung remembering a trick it had wanted to forget. I set the coin on the salt line again and went back to the station. In the green glow, the faces of my patients looked like paper cutouts. Devon snored the fragile snore of someone practicing adulthood. Sally's lips moved around a refusal or acceptance. I couldn't tell. Mike breathed like a truck idling at a diner. At 1:03, the elevator opened and did not close. That is not how emergency power works. It makes compromises, but not ones that look like invitations. From inside the car, a soft light bled into the hall. The coin on the floor turned another quarter. Turn and the salt around it trembled, as if a train had passed underground, the way they do in cities with secrets. I went to the doors and put my forehead against the glass. The window was cold through my skin. It steadied me. Far down the opposite hall, at the corner where the bell cord hung, a figure stood. It was slender, shoulders narrow, under what might have been a gown. It stood the way people stand when their bodies have been taught obedience by beeps. It turned its head, not a head, a sense of attention, and looked up the length of the corridor into the little window where my eyes were. It lifted its hand and pressed the rounded side of it against the wall, where the shadow of a hand should be, and left no shadow. It pulled the bell cord once, and the bell chimed, rapped and rung. I took the radio and said, 5th to Central, visual, request guidance, static. Then, faint, under it, the words we use for other emergencies. Code this, code that. Numbers meaning floors, numbers meaning rooms, somebody somewhere counting. Iris's voice cut through, do not open those doors. The figure took a step. Inside the room behind it, tiny lights pulsed in ordered rows. Red, green, amber, the way monitor towers do when they are waiting for a heart. The figure did not move like a predator and did not move like a friend. It moved like protocol. It moved like instruction. It moved like a bell given legs. Iris's bell on a red string was in my pocket because I had taken it when she wasn't looking. It had weight that didn't belong to its size. I held it and felt the split in the lip with my thumb. I could ring it. The split would make the note ragged, like grief. The building would answer with its own tone. Everything in me wanted to make a sound, because human beings are built to command rooms by making noise. Instead, I set the bell down next to the coin and moved the salt with the edge of my hand to make the line straight again. Not like that, I said very softly, to something that could either be insulted by defiance or pleased by etiquette. Not here. The figure reached the intersection. It stopped. In the room behind it, a crib light went out. The figure tilted, a patient nod, the kind nurses make when their hands are busy. It turned and moved back down the hall, with the same careful speed until it slid out of sight, like practice coming to an end. At 2:26, the power returned to the part of the building that believed in me. The elevator doors closed with a little apology, and the coin lay in the salt like a toe in a bath. The bell beyond the doors chimed twice. Courtesy, twice. Reminiscence, once. Agreement. In room 3, Sally said Miriam again and smiled with relief that made me ache. Her EEG wrote sleep like handwriting. When dawn came, it came reluctantly, dragging light like a sheet. I turned my patients over to the day tech. In the elevator, Iris pressed the bell into my hand and said, "Put this where it belongs." She let me into central supply with a key that always smelled like the pocket where keys live. The neonatal bell sat in a plastic bin, labeled in a hand that didn't believe in ghosts. Bell do not ring. I put Iris's bell next to it, and for a moment the two bells looked at each other, the way animals do at the Humane Society, when the cages face. I wrote a note that said, "Don't break this box either," and stuck it to the lid, because I have learned there is always a person whose job it is to solve problems by opening things. On the way home, I stopped at the thrift store that smells like old sugar and found a pair of baby shoes in a box of socks. They were white, soft, the leather creased in the places where tiny feet decide which steps are theirs. I bought them for $1, and on the next night, before lights out, I placed them at the base of the double doors, toes touching, laces tucked. Then I messed them up. I set one sideways and tucked one lace into the other and said, "Not like that," to a room that had already learned my handwriting. The coin turned once, approving or disapproving. I couldn't tell. I kept the job through fall until the hospital decided to move the lab to the West Campus with the rest of what it believed in. On my last night, Iris came up with a cake that tasted like freezers and a card that said "Good luck, Maya" in block letters, like a plea. The patients slept like pages being turned in a book you promised to reread. The doors didn't flex. The bell beyond the hall didn't chime. I sat at the station with the coin on my palm and the salt pouch like a little ridiculous animal at my elbow and wondered if I had imagined a season. At 4:03, the negative pressure fans kicked on. The doors bowed and eased. A draft walked the hall. It carried the smell of paper and milk and antiseptic and the sweetness of something put away too long. The bell chimed once, rapped and struck. I put the coin back on the floor. I didn't lay the salt. The doors bowed and eased. The figure at the end of the hall stood where it had before, careful, tall, and then did something it had not done. It lifted its hand and set it on the glass where my forehead had rested the first night, and held it there, a patient pressure, as if to check for fever. The glass was cold through my face. "Not here," I said, not a command anymore. A wish. The pressure eased. The bell chimed once. Farewell and not. The figure nodded like a nurse, again, and withdrew. In room 2, Arlene smiled in her sleep and said, "Miriam," and then said, "I can," and sometimes that's the whole story. My last act on the 5th floor was to take the little white shoes, pair them neatly, set them by the doors, and untie one lace. I left the coin on the floor and the salt pouch on the desk and the bell in its box. Iris locked the double doors behind me and turned the key in a way that told me she was older than I had let myself notice. We rode down and said nothing and drank lukewarm peppermint tea and pretended that we had never learned anything about bells. I still count my shoes before bed. If I wake at 3, I use the voice of my work. I name what I am doing. I say, "Lights out at 22:30, decets minimal with correction, documentation incomplete." If a bell rings in the distance in an old building or on a street where children play with found metal, I let it be part of the room that needs it. Sometimes I think I smell milk that has learned patience. Sometimes I think I hear a rapt chime that has decided to attend to its own story. If I put my forehead against a window in the night, the glass is only glass. If it is colder than it should be, I move my head and find another place to rest it. I do not ring what I didn't hang. I do not open what others closed on purpose. I touch the coin in my pocket like a person who has been allowed not to make a sound and still be heard. Now, on to the next story. It wasn't the wind that woke me. It was the patient voice outside the cabin window, counting my breaths. 1, 2, 3. The glass hummed with each number as if the sound were something physical, a fingertip vibrating on the pane. I lay perfectly still on the narrow bed, blanket to my chin, and the frost, feathery and bright, began to vein across the window in time with the counting. 4. I had come here to sleep. People go to cabins for different reasons: fishing, writing, escaping. I came because my nights had collapsed into a dull red ache behind the eyes. A friend of a friend told me Black Spruce Lake could fix that. A few nights there, he said, and the quiet folds over you like a heavy coat. The town that owned the lake was a long splinter of buildings: a bait shop, a diner with a neon sign that glowed like a cracked tooth, a rental office tacked onto something that might have been a garage or a barn once. The woman at the counter had cheeks chapped by years of wind, old lady pretty, decisive in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime deciding for others. She said her name was May. I asked for the keys to a cabin, and she said, "You'll be in Old Harper's," like it was a diagnosis. She slid a folded map across the counter and tapped the spit of land the cabin sat on. "Right at the big cedar, left where the road gives up," she said. "Generator works, but don't use it unless you must. There's kindling stacked up, there's a kettle," and she stopped, eyes flicking up to mine as if deciding whether I was a person who deserved all the instructions. "If you hear counting at night," she said, "don't answer, let it finish." I must have made a face because she added almost kindly, "You don't want to lend your breath to the borrower." The word sat oddly in the room, like a stone under a rug. I nodded, the polite nod of an outsider hearing a local myth he doesn't intend to take home with him. She did not nod back. On my way out, she pressed a thin, over-photocopied pamphlet into my hand. "Staying at Black Spruce. Notes from old times," it said. Between advice on keeping your kindling dry and boiling water if you didn't trust the pipes, a paragraph in faint ink read, "If you hear the night counting, do not give it company. Count your own breath quietly for yourself and none else. It will count you to safe sleep if you leave your numbers to it. Do not repeat. Do not reply. If your sleep is poor, borrow a kettle before you borrow the night." Old Harper's was a long wooden box on a finger of shore where the lake curved in like a palm. The trees leaned over the roof as if listening. Inside was a stove with a pipe that went up and out, a bed and a bench, a small table with the kettle heavy as a pocket watch, a single window in each room. Someone had nailed braided rosemary sprigs above the door. I unpacked with the deliberation of a person who has been tired for months and is practicing slowness like a new language. The fire took, hunched, and then flared. The kettle hissed, the air filled with cedar and old ash and a simple metal warmth. When dusk folded itself around the lake, the surface turned to India ink and held the moon like a coin at the bottom of a well. I lay down early because exhaustion makes a liar of you. It tells you sleep is a shore you can swim to. The sheet was cool. The blanket smelled of sun from some earlier summer. I left the curtain open because fear, for me, has always been worse in the dark you make yourself. I lay on my side and counted my breath. In for 4, out for 6. Counting is a rope thrown into water. Sometimes it's the only rope you have. The next thing I remember is the voice. 1, it whispered, and my lungs obeyed. 2, 3. The voice was right outside the window, so close that if I lifted my head, I could have pressed my face to the glass and fogged the place its mouth must have been. The numbers were gentle, almost grandfatherly, neither hurried nor slow. They matched the shape of each inhale and exhale, until the act of breathing felt like an answer to a question. 4, 5. I told myself to roll over. I did not. Tiredness is a soft coercion. It makes you meek to anything that says it will shepherd you toward rest. After 10, the voice paused. The silence that followed was not the same silence the room had been holding. It had edges. From the stove, a small tick as metal adjusted. From the lake, a shiver of water under ice. I let my shoulders loosen. I might have slept. Then the voice continued, as if it had only paused to tie its boot. 11, 12. I don't know whether I slept after that or fell into a gray underwater drift. Either way, when morning came and the window was a wide white square, my body felt as if it had lain obedient through a kind instruction rather than a night. I made tea and ate an apple out on the steps. The air smelled like resin and cold water. There were faint foggy prints on the outside of the window, as if someone had set their hands there, the way a person does when they lean to look in. They might have been anything, old smears, the ghost of a bird. I wiped them with my sleeve, and the glass squealed, high and helpless, and I stopped and turned the kettle off before it sang, so I wouldn't feel like I'd cut the voice of a friend. Near noon, May arrived in a coat that looked like it had been made for 4 winters and had survived 6. She carried a bundle of split logs and a coil of thin brass bells. "For your door," she said, not waiting for me to step aside to let her in. "The borrower keeps manners if it has to count 2 ways. These help it forget itself." She set the logs by the stove and the bells on the table. Up close, she smelled like soap and wood smoke and the faint, peppery brown of peat. "How'd the first night go?" she asked. I told her I'd slept, which was true if you were generous with the definition. I told her I'd heard counting, which was truer than I wanted it to be. I did not tell her that matching my breath to that voice had felt like stepping into a river and letting it take my weight. "Left side of the lake keeps more of the old things," she said. "The spit points into them like a finger in a forgotten pocket." I told her I didn't understand, because I didn't. "There are several versions of the borrower," she said, moving as she spoke, straightening the kettle, poking the stove, the way old women always make their talking useful. "We keep the version with the boy, the winter that froze the lake skin to bone. There wasn't wood enough for every hearth. There was a man who used to split for a dozen houses. Strong lungs, strong back, got sick. The boy counted his father's breaths in the bed for 3 days, thinking numbers were a kind of prayer, and that if he kept the scaffold of counting around the lungs, they would not fall. It didn't work. The father died at 39, with sawdust still under his nails. The boy's counting went on a while after because the house remembered it. Then the houses nearby heard it in the walls. That winter, when the wind went hunting, the counting went with it and stood at the windows to see who would lend it a breath. Some did. Those houses burned hotter. Some didn't. Those houses burned bright and brief and then went blue. I thought borrowing breath was a metaphor," I said, and tried to laugh. May did not. "Everything alive borrows," she said. "Some things return the cup clean, some don't. Don't feed it numbers with your mouth and do not answer. Hang the bells. Keep water on." That evening, the voice began earlier, while there was still a stale light in the sky. It came with twilight bird song and the small, wet noise of ice giving way at the edge of the lake. 1. I had the bells on the door. They rang softly every time the cabin breathed. I kept the kettle on the stove so that steam threaded the air. Still, the counting came to the window as if the bells were a wavering light. It had paused to admire before resuming its walk. 2, 3. It stopped at 10 again. I lay there, face to the glass. There is a bravery that looks like turning your face to whatever is there. It is a foolish bravery, but it belongs to me. When the voice resumed at 11, I thought briefly of whispering 12, a childish impulse, stepping on an old man's step to make him stumble. Instead, I put the blanket corner between my teeth like a boy. I didn't mean to speak to it. I had promised May in my polite nod that I would not. But sometime near the middle of the night, a dream broke, like a wave, and left me sitting up. My hand was on the glass, palm matching the spot where those morning smears had been. Outside, the voice had gone quiet. I don't know how long it had been quiet. If I had to guess, I would say the length of an inhale held, long and unwise. The window was cold under my hand. The lake made a small sound, like a secret told to itself. I found my throat and said without thinking, "I'm here," 2 words. The glass fogged suddenly where my mouth had been. The quiet outside the window changed color, as if the air had shifted to another depth. Then the voice answered, very gently, "I know. I lay down the way you lower yourself into snow, carefully, careful of making a noise that might get noticed." My heart had the hooked flutter of a fish under ice. The counting did not begin again. The bells on the door did not ring. The kettle ticked like a clock trying to remember what direction time lived in. I slept, but not with the kind of sleep that restored anything. I slept the way you sleep when you have handed a stranger your address and remembered after the fact that you never asked for his name. In the morning, there were 4 sets of prints in the frost below the window. Not boots, not barefoot, something narrower than either, with a 2 even spacing. They braided back and forth like someone had walked there and paced, impatient, counting. I put my boot heel over one, and the size was wrong in a way that made my stomach lurch. I went back inside and held the brass bells in my hands until my palms stung. I boiled water until the cabin swam in steam. I read May's pamphlet again, squinting through the old ink. Do not repeat, do not reply. The words looked like bad grammar at first, and then like good medicine. I lasted through the day without seeing anyone. The lake made itself busy by pretending to be glass and then reminding you it was water. Late afternoon, the clouds gathered in a bruise over the hills. I chopped kindling until my shoulders ached, and then stood and listened to the woods breathe. It's strange what bodies want when they are frightened. Mine wanted to be told what to do by a voice that came to a window at night. When May knocked just before dark, the bells sang. She stood on the step the way cats do, halfway in and halfway out, keeping her back to the open. I told her I might have answered. I didn't want to say the words, but I knew the math. If I hid them, the numbers would add themselves anyway. Her face did something that wasn't a frown. "It knows your name now," she said, but she said it without malice. "You'll have to be stubborn for a few nights. Don't give it a number to stand on. Let it count itself. If it has to count itself, it gets tired." She looked at the window. "If you give it your name again, it will climb on." "Climb on what?" I asked. "Your breath," she said. "The old people say breath is a rope. Every rope leads back to a body. It will follow. If it sits on you, it makes you sleep hard, heavy. You think that's a kindness until you don't wake." "There were prints," I said. "Odd ones." "They look that way," she said. "One generation thinks they're deer hooves. Another thinks they're the heels of a child's hand. We say they're numbers, walking." That night, the voice did not bother with the numbers at first. It knocked, politely, the way rain knocks on a window when it wants to become snow. I put the pillow over my head and counted into the cotton until my breath sounded like surf. The bells shook a little each time I shifted. When the voice began its numbers, it did so in a whisper, almost embarrassed. 1, 2, 3. It skipped entirely from 10 to 15, and then I heard it begin to count the bells, softly, lightly, like a person charming a child. I did not move. I think I slept the way a dozed animal sleeps, neck muscles still half cocked, ears half open, ready to swallow the sound of its own name if it came. In the hollow of night there was a change. Cold that had been outside was suddenly inside. The air thinned, as if a door had opened and stayed open, and the lake had sent its absence into the room. Something sat on the foot of the bed. I know the difference between spring shifting and weight. This was weight. Something old enough to be patient and small enough to travel by window frame had climbed onto the blanket and found the hill of my legs and settled there. The numbers resumed, but they were not outside now. They were nearer. The voice felt nearer than my own tongue. 1, 2, 3. The counting fit around my ribs. At 5 it pressed, pressing me down into the mattress as if the bed were water and my body the rock it had been waiting to submerge. The brass bells made no sound. The kettle had blown itself dry into silence. In the seam between 6 and 7, I found a ragged edge of breath and tugged. The voice followed, amiably, delighted, as if I had shown it the knot it wanted. 8, 9. I don't know what saved me from saying 10. Habit, maybe, or stubbornness left over from days when I thought the body was a thing you could boss. I bit the inside of my cheek, and the pain threw a small light across the room. I made a sound that was not a number, a low animal moan into the pillow. The weight at the foot of the bed shifted, wronged. The counting faltered. Then the voice, almost petulant, said, "Name." It sounded like my mother calling me from a porch at dusk when I was a child. That gentle rebuke in it, and everything sweet about obedience rose in my throat. I wanted to say my name the way you want to step into warm water. I jammed my knuckles between my teeth until the urge shook itself out and lay down. The weight lifted, the air pressed itself back into the shape of the room. Outside, a little trotting of those odd prints, back and forth, like a man thinking and wearing a path into the ground. When morning came light, had silvered the frost in the yard, and the numbers of the prints were tangled under the window like a math problem done by a frustrated child. I made tea and watched my breath. I slept at the table with my face in my arms, and woke to the feeling that someone had been standing behind me, carefully counting the hairs at the nape of my neck. You can tell a story is true by the way it gets harder to talk about the closer you are to its middle. On the third day, I walked to town. The road gave up exactly where the map had promised. The cedar greeted me with a black ribbon someone had tied around its trunk. The sky was a faded bruise. At the rental office, the bell over the door struggled to make noise. May looked at me and knew. "It's heavier than it should be for a stranger," she said. "Some folks carry a shape that fits it. Some folks it drapes over and can't find a way to fasten. I'm sorry you're the first sort." "What do I do?" I asked. "Keep the bells. Keep the water singing. Don't give it a foothold. Don't give it your name." "How long?" "Until either you leave," she said, "or it remembers another house it liked better. Was there ever a time it took someone?" May's eyes moved a little, as if she were watching something cross the back room. "Once," she said. "Many years back. A young man with a cough that sat on his chest. He liked the counting, said it felt like the night had learned his measure. He started sleeping and sleeping. When we came to wake him, he was ash cold and still smiling. He'd counted himself out and didn't notice. I stood in the little shop of hooks and lines and jars of bright lures, pretending to be insects, and felt the sudden, ridiculous desire to cry. Tiredness makes everything vast. May put a bar of carbolic soap in a paper bag and handed it to me like a sacrament. "The rosemary above the door?" she asked. I nodded good. "If the bells try to tangle, untangle them. They try that when they are frightened. You can't keep the borrower out with a lock, but you can keep yourself out of its pocket." I went back to the cabin and did exactly what she said. I boiled the kettle and threw the steam around the room with a towel, like a priest throwing water. I straightened the bells. I laid fresh rosemary on the window ledge, and the smell stitched the air shut in a way that calmed me. Twilight came early, bringing that peculiar purple that tells you you've misjudged your day. I set a chair by the stove and told myself I would sit up through the night and count my own numbers, loudly, to drown the other. I lasted past midnight. My eyes closed on their own. When I jerked them open again, the counting was already in the room. It had learned something about me, the voice. It began by matching the pace of my lungs, then slowing so that I had to either disobey it or follow. I followed. The numbers lengthened between breaths, and what had been a rhythm became a drawl, and then a lull. My body relaxed in ways it had forgotten how to relax. The weight returned to the bed, higher this time, like a cat testing whether a lap is safe. A warm, drowsy happiness slid through me, and behind it, like a boat behind a larger boat's wake, came fear. The voice reached 9 and stopped. My breath waited. I waited with it, mouth parted. The pause was not empty. It was full of the word I wanted to say. 10, it would have been. A simple, obedient 10. The shape of that sound pushed hard against my teeth. The bells saved me. They rang suddenly, sharp, angry, though no one had touched the door. The rosemary crackled like a leaf thrown on fire. The weight flinched. The number I'd been waiting to say fell back into the room unspoken and broke like a dish. The voice made a small, wounded noise. It said my name again, not sweet this time, but with disappointment, and you can murder a person with disappointment as surely as with anything. I stared at the ceiling and counted the cracks and tried to remember what my hands looked like in sunlight. Somewhere below the window, the strange prints scuffed in agitation. After a while, the voice went outside and paced and counted to itself. It did not come in again that night. Dawn made me greedy. I began to believe in an ending. I believed I could do one more night. 2, perhaps. If I could just keep stubborn, the way May had said, the borrower would go to a different pocket and leave me to my sleep and my small life. I boiled the kettle. I opened the door to let the bells have their say. I laid the rosemary fresh. I swept up the ash and made the stove polite, thinking as I did that I had never in my life been careful for so many hours at once. The last night began with rain that wanted to be snow. The lake took the weather the way a patient person takes a lecture. I sat at the table and wrote my name out on a scrap of paper in big block letters, and then struck a match and burned the paper in the stove and watched the smoke go up. I told myself that the name in the room was less now, and that there was less for the voice to catch. I must have laughed at myself, because for a moment I felt like a person at a party, somebody having a joke, which is to say a person who has forgotten that the dark can hear. When it started with a single word, not a number, my name, said with such ordinary kindness that I nearly stood to go to the door. There's a sound people use when they finally find you, after they've been looking. The voice had found that sound. It found it, and it wore it, and it came to my window with it. The bells rang, and then stilled. The rosemary smoked, and then went out. The kettle sighed into silence. The window glass clouded, as if 2 hands had been placed there. The weight came straight to my chest and sat. Breath is a rope, May had said. I felt mine pulled. Not hard, not yet, just taken in hand, like a horse's rein. The numbers came then, close and slow, the voice holding my breath's rope lightly. 1. The inhale happened, whether I wanted it or not. 2. The exhale left me with a little sound that embarrassed me. 3. At 4, the room seemed to tip a degree. At 5, I understood, with the clarity that sometimes arrives when fear unclutters the mind, that this was someone's kindness mislearned, a boy counting a father's breaths to keep him alive. The world forgets to tell a kindness when it is finished. It keeps doing itself until it's cruelty. I thought of May at her counter with her hands folded. I thought of the lures shining like fake dragonflies in their jars. I thought of the rosemary above the door and the way the bells announced and comforted. I thought of the young man she had told me about, smiling ash cold. The voice said 6. I said nothing. The voice said 7 and touched my breath like a thread pulled through a needle's eye. I said nothing. At 8, the thing on my chest shifted its weight and put a hand-shaped pressure where my heart lives, and I heard myself make a small agreeing sound. 9, it said, pleased. And there it was, the soft space for the last number, the cliff's lip, with the jump waiting on the other side. I don't think I can tell you what kept the 10 in my mouth. Pride? Contrariness. The animal in me that dislikes being led. I found my tongue and put it against the roof of my mouth and held the shape of the word there and did not let it fall out. The window suddenly rattled. The bells banged. The rosemary flamed green and sharp without a match. The weight rose off me in a sulk and swept to the window. The glass whined the way glass whines when cold means to break it. Then the voice did something I had not heard it do. It began to count backward. 9, it said, and the room went brighter by a shade, as if someone had opened a curtain an inch. 8, it said, and the air arranged itself back around my lungs. 7, my hands felt like mine. 6, the weight lightened. 5, the bells kept time. 4, the rosemary went back to smoke. 3, the lake laid its water down. 2, the voice that had known my name took it in its mouth and rolled it once, fondly, like a marble. 1, the window went clear. I slept then, not because it willed me, but because my body toppled into sleep, the way bodies do when they've been held toward the ground and then released. When morning came, the prints in the yard were not there. The glass was clean. The bells hung like quiet mouths. The rosemary above the door had gone gray. May came as the sun lifted from its knees. I told her what had happened, and she looked out at the lake for a long time before answering. Sometimes it remembers how to leave, she said. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it needs someone stubborn enough to make it practice. She did not say I had done well. She did not say I had been lucky. She put her hand on the door frame where the rosemary had been and nodded as if the wood had said something she agreed with. I left Old Harper's 2 hours later. The road took me like a patient animal who had expected me to return to it eventually. At the edge of town, I stopped at the diner. The neon tooth blinked in time with the blinking of my own tired eyes. I ordered eggs and ate them slowly. When I paid at the register, May's pamphlets were stacked in a neat pale tower. I took one and put it in my coat pocket and told myself I would keep it like a ticket stub from a show that had frightened me. Sometimes in my apartment now, the radiator knocks a little at night, and I wake with the word 10 on my tongue like a seed. I put a kettle on even when I don't want tea. I keep a sprig of rosemary above my door. The soap in my bathroom smells like carbolic and smoke. No one has stood outside my window to count since I left the lake. If something ever does, I have a plan. I will let it count. I will let it tire itself out. I will keep my numbers for myself. If it asks my name, I will fold my tongue in half and be quiet. And if it begins to count backward, I will lie very still and listen until the last number empties the room and I can sleep again, alone with the sound of my own breath, which is just a rope I am borrowing, like everything else. Now, on to the next story. The lake had no name on the map, just a pale blue oval hidden under contour lines, 10 miles of forest between it and the nearest road. The ranger who handed me the cabin key had called it the Drowned Lake, then shook his head like he wished he hadn't. He said it quiet, too, the way you say a thing you don't want the trees to hear. I thought he was being dramatic. I should have listened better. The cabin sat right on the shore, its porch sinking into damp earth, its stilts chewed by moss. Every board had drunk water until it was swollen and dark. The chimney leaned like it had grown tired of standing, but the view was perfect. The lake spread silver and flat as hammered steel, ringed by pines so tall they seemed to hold up the clouds. No motorboats, no houses, just me, the cabin, and the water. Exactly what I thought I wanted. Silence. Inside was simpler than I expected. A table, a bed, a stove whose pipe disappeared into the roof. The air smelled of mildew and the faint mineral tang of wet stone. On the wall, carved into the log just above the table, were words I could barely read under the stain. Don't let it see your face. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire, cooked beans in a blackened pan, and sat listening to the crackle. Outside the window, the lake held the moon like a coin. It was too still, though. No frogs, no fish breaking the surface, not even an insect buzzing. Water without noise is water without life, and that thought itched the back of my brain until I forced myself to bed. I dreamed of swimming. The water was warm, too warm, almost the temperature of blood. I floated on my back with my ears dipped under the surface and heard something speaking, not in words I knew, but in a slow murmur like a chant rising and falling. I woke with my chest tight, convinced for a moment that the sound was still going, but the cabin was silent except for the stove's cooling sigh. Morning was worse. I went to the porch to drink coffee and found prints on the damp boards. Not boots, not paws, something in between, long and narrow, with a webbed look to the toes. They came up from the lake, trailed across the porch, and went straight to the window where my bed was. Then they turned and slid back into the water. My skin went cold in a way the air couldn't explain. I tried to tell myself it was a raccoon or an otter, something half erased by the rain, but the shape was too precise. Each print pressed with a neat, wet edge, as if made recently. I chopped wood until my arms ached, just to burn the thought out of my head. The lake stayed still, too still, not a ripple touched it. Even the wind seemed to bend around its surface rather than disturb it. I remembered the ranger's voice, that muttered name, the drowned lake. Drowned things sink. Drowned things also rise. The second night, I lay in bed listening harder than I've ever listened to anything. For hours, there was only the normal language of wood and wind. Then, near midnight, I heard the water move, just once, a sound like a hand sliding across wet glass. My heart tripped. I lay rigid, staring at the ceiling. Another sound followed, closer, the careful drip of water on wood. Porch boards creaked. Something was walking outside. The prince. My mind whispered it before I could shut it up. The steps went to the door, paused, then to the window. The glass fogged, just faintly, though I hadn't breathed on it. A pale blur pressed close, but the frost veined across the pane so thick I couldn't see detail. I rolled over, back to the window, blanket over my head, like I was 10 years old again. The boards creaked once more, then silence. When morning came, the porch was wet again. Fresh prints darkened the boards. They lingered for hours in the cold, refusing to dry. I thought of the words carved into the wall. Don't let it see your face. Something had been at the window trying. By the third night, I was jumpy. Every knot in the wood looked like an eye. Every pop of the stove made me flinch. I told myself to be brave, to sit by the fire with a book, but the words slid off the page. When the sound came, I was already waiting. The water stirred first, slow and deliberate, then the steps, closer this time. When they reached the porch, I forced myself to look. Through the glass I saw it, not clearly. The frost smeared the details, but I saw the shape lean close, saw the pale gleam of eyes too large, too round. Water dripped from its skin, ran down the pane in tiny rivers. The lantern light inside caught its outline, just enough to show it wasn't shaped right. Too long in the limbs, too thin in the chest, fingers that ended not in nails, but in points, pressed lightly against the glass. The head tilted, curious. It was looking for my face. I dropped flat to the floor, heart hammering so hard the boards thumped with it. I crawled until the bed hid me from the window, and lay there holding my breath. The glass ticked once, twice, like something testing it. Then the sound of wet feet sliding back across the porch. The water moved again, folding shut like a door. I didn't sleep at all. Morning brought fog. It rolled across the lake thick as wool, creeping up the shore, curling around the stilts of the cabin. From the porch, I couldn't see more than 10 feet into it. I thought about leaving, but the trail back was long and easy to lose, and fog is a liar. It makes the world smaller than it is. I stayed. That afternoon, I found something nailed to the underside of the porch rail, a strip of tin carved with crude letters. Stay unseen, stay alive. The nails were rusted nearly through. Whoever put it there had done it years ago, maybe decades. I ran my thumb along the edge of the tin and wondered how many people had read that warning too late. That night the fog never lifted. Darkness came early, heavy and damp. I sat with every lantern burning, all 3 of them, though the light only made the fog outside glow thicker. The water stirred. The porch groaned. I clutched the poker from the stove and told myself not to move. The steps reached the door, slow, deliberate. The latch trembled. I had locked it, but locks only keep out the polite. The thing pressed against the wood, not hard, just testing. Then it went to the window again. I didn't look. I couldn't. My chest ached with holding still. Then, softly, it tapped. Once, twice, a pause, then again, not random, measured, like knocking in a pattern. I realized with horror it was trying to make me look, to make me curious, to get my face close to the glass. The tapping stopped. A moment of silence stretched thin. Then a new sound came, so quiet I almost missed it. A whisper, muffled by the glass, but still sharp enough to crawl under my skin. It said my name. I dropped the poker. The metal clanged so loud the thing went silent. I stared at the bedpost, not daring to blink. It whispered again. My name, drawn out, watery, the syllables wrong in its mouth. I bit my tongue until blood filled my mouth, just to keep from answering. The whisper grew frustrated, the voice gurgling like it came through water. Then the steps retreated, the lake folded shut. When I finally looked, there was a smear across the glass. Not a handprint. Not exactly. More like the drag of something webbed, streaking downward as it slid away. The smear on the window dried slow. I sat watching it until the lantern burned low, as if the streak itself might start to move again. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time I tried to set them in my lap, they twitched back to fists. When the first gray of dawn came, I thought I had survived. I thought maybe it would leave me alone now that it had tried and failed. But the prints on the porch told a different story. There were more of them than before. Dozens, overlapping, circling. They covered every inch of the boards, weaving and crossing, until I couldn't tell where one set ended and another began. They trailed down to the water, but not in a straight line. No, the pattern looped back and forth, a restless pacing, like something waiting for me to step out. I drank coffee cold because I couldn't be bothered with the stove. My eyes kept sliding to the lake. The fog had lifted some, but the surface still looked wrong. Too still, too dark, as though it were more than water, as though it were a lid, and lids are for keeping something shut in. I thought of leaving again. I even packed my bag, rolled my blanket, tightened the straps, but every time I looked at the trail into the trees, the silence there stopped me. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no chatter of squirrels, just the dull hum of water behind me, pulling at my attention. I knew if I stepped into the woods, I would look back, and the instant I looked back, the lake would not be behind me anymore. It would be in front, waiting. I tried to busy myself. I chopped more wood. I swept the cabin. I even reread the old newspaper scraps stuffed in the cracks of the wall for insulation, though they were nothing but weather reports from decades past. But when the sun started sinking, my heart sank with it. Night would bring it again. The thing in the lake wasn't patient anymore. That evening, before the light even fully left, the water stirred. Not just a ripple this time, but a roll, as if something large had shifted beneath. I froze at the porch, axe still in my hand. The surface smoothed. For a heartbeat, it looked normal. Then bubbles rose, a scatter of them. and something pale broke the surface near the center. Not a head, not exactly, but something head-shaped. Round, slick, glistening. It lingered just long enough to catch the last gold of the sun. Then it sank. I went inside and barred the door. The steps came sooner that night. No long wait, no teasing. Straight from the lake to the porch, wet slaps on the wood, straight to the door. The latch rattled. I shoved the table against it, then the chair, then stacked the wood pile in front for good measure. The whole wall groaned when it leaned. The whisper came next. My name repeated, soft, then harder, then soft again, as though trying out different voices. I pressed my palms to my ears, but the sound was inside my skull, vibrating bone. I clenched my teeth and mouthed words of refusal, though I dared not speak them aloud. The wall shivered under the weight, then silence. I let out a long breath. Too soon. The window behind me cracked, not shattered, cracked, a thin white vein running across the pane. I spun and saw it, the pale face, inches from mine, separated only by failing glass. It wasn't a human face. The eyes were too wide, too round, glowing faintly as if lit from behind. The skin sagged and swelled, slick with water, and when it opened its mouth, I saw not teeth but something soft and frilled, like the inside of a gill. I stumbled back, the poker clattered from my hands. The thing leaned closer, the glass bowing inward. A low groan filled the room, wood and water and breath all at once. My vision tunneled. In some panicked animal part of me, I remembered the carved words, "Don't let it see your face." I dropped to the floor, covering my head, pressing my cheek to the boards. The crack deepened with a sound like ice splitting. Then, after a long moment, it stopped. I lay there for hours, listening to the sound of dripping retreating across the porch, until I finally passed out from exhaustion. When I woke, it was noon. The window held, but only barely. The crack spidered wider. The smear from the night before had been washed away, replaced with a long streak that looked almost deliberate, as though something had drawn a line with its finger. The prints on the porch were deeper, pressed harder, as if something heavier had stood there this time. I ate nothing. Hunger was small compared to fear. My eyes kept drifting to the water. In daylight, it looked almost normal, almost safe, and that was worse. It was pretending. It wanted me to relax, to step outside at night without thinking. That afternoon, desperate for some anchor of sanity, I searched the cabin top to bottom. Most of what I found was useless. Rusted traps, scraps of canvas, a broken lantern. But under the bed, stuffed deep into the slats, I found a tin box. Inside were pages, brittle and brown, a journal. The first entries were mundane, weather reports, lists of fish caught, complaints about rain. Then, about halfway through, the first entries were mundane, weather reports, lists of fish caught, complaints about rain. Then, about halfway through, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew frantic. The lines cramped. It comes up at night. Always at night. You mustn't look at it straight. I saw its eyes once, and I felt it in me after, crawling. I covered the glass, but it still found a way. The lake is not water, not truly. It is a door. It wants us to open it. The last entry was barely legible, scrawled with a shaking hand. It waits for my face. If it learns it, it will wear it, and once it wears me, it will walk where I walk. I put the journal back and shoved the box under the bed. I didn't want it near me. That night was the worst. The fog rolled in thicker than before, a wall of white that pressed against the windows. I couldn't see the lake at all. That should have comforted me, but instead, it felt worse, like the fog was the thing's body, stretching in to smother the cabin. The sound began differently this time, not steps, not dripping, singing, a low hum, like someone chanting underwater. The notes pressed against the glass made the air vibrate. My bones hurt with it. I clutched the poker, but it felt useless, a toy against something this old. The singing grew louder, then broke into words, my name, but longer, stretched into a song. My vision swam, my muscles loosened. I felt the urge to get up, to walk to the window, to press my face against the glass so it could finally see me. My legs moved without permission. I dropped the poker on purpose, bent to grab it, and stayed bent, forehead to the floor, forcing myself still. My teeth cut my lip. I tasted iron. The song grew angry, the notes discordant. The walls trembled, the window groaned, then silence. I held still for minutes, afraid to believe it gone. Slowly I lifted my head. The window was dark, no face, no light. For a moment I thought I had won. Then I noticed the door. The latch was lifting, slowly, deliberately, 1 inch at a time. The nails I'd hammered in weren't enough. The table and chair groaned. The latch clicked higher. My heart jammed into my throat. I staggered to the stove and grabbed the pot of boiling water, flinging it against the door. Steam erupted, filling the room. A hiss followed, not of water on wood, but of something living, recoiling. The latch dropped. The steps retreated. I fell to my knees, coughing in the steam. My skin burned where the water splashed, but I didn't care. I was alive, for now. When morning came, the fog lifted just enough to show the lake. The surface was broken, not a ripple, not a wave, broken, as though something had clawed at it from underneath. Pale shapes moved just beneath, too large to be fish. I slammed the shutters closed and didn't look again. I lasted another day in the cabin, but by evening I knew I couldn't stay. The thing was growing bolder. Sooner or later the window would give, or the door. I would either leave on my own terms, or it would drag me under. So I packed rope, food, water, the journal too, though I hated it because maybe proof mattered. I would leave at dawn, fog or no fog. I told myself this like a prayer, over and over, until exhaustion pulled me under. I dreamed of the lake again, only this time I wasn't swimming. I was standing on the porch, and the thing was in the water, calling me. But it didn't look like a monster. It looked like me, my face, pale and wet, smiling up from the dark. I woke screaming, and outside answering, something screamed back. The scream that answered mine didn't come from the porch or the trees. It came from the lake. It tore across the water like a knife dragged through silk, high and thin and hungry, and the cabin answered with a long groan that sounded like fear wearing wood. I clapped a hand over my mouth and forced the other to find the lantern and turn the wick down. Darkness gathered in the corners. The scream dwindled into a wet, choking laugh, and then into a hush so complete my own heartbeat felt like a trespass. I didn't sleep again. I sat on the floor with my back to the bed, pack already shouldered, rope coiled at my hip, the journal wedged under the strap. I waited for light the way a patient waits for the door to open, and for the doctor to use a kinder word than the one on the chart. When dawn finally came, it came sickly and gray, as if the sun had been dragged halfway to the surface and left there to drown. Fog pressed its body against the windows. My plan, such as it was, had always been to walk at first light and not look back. I told myself it was still first light. I told myself not to look back. I cracked the door, and the fog slid in, soft and cold and intimate. Every hair on my arms rose. The porch boards shone with damp. The prints were already there, fresh and deep, toes splayed, webbing cut into the wood grain. They came up from the water and stood in a tight cluster by the door, like a little crowd had gathered to hear the sermon. My stomach turned over. I stepped onto the porch anyway. The fog closed around me. The water was gone behind its white. The forest was gone. The only things left in the world were the cabin at my back and the idea of a trail ahead. I touched the door frame once, an old habit for luck. The wood felt warm, almost feverish, as if the cabin had kept the heat of my nights and was reluctant to let me go. "Stay unseen, stay alive," I whispered, and didn't know whether I was reminding the cabin or myself. Then I stepped down into the yard and into the fog. Sound behaves strangely in fog. It travels and it doesn't. My bootsteps were loud under me and silent 2 feet away. When I paused to listen, the world held its breath. I picked a direction and walked it, counting each step under my breath, because numbers make a spine you can hang your body on. After 100, I stopped and turned my head a fraction. No slosh of water, no whisper against wood. The fog was a room with no doors. I kept walking. Somewhere around 300, I felt the ground change. The damp spring of moss gave to the firmer, pebbled feel of the old survey path, the one I'd followed in, the one I'd nearly lost even in clear weather. Relief made my knees weak. I put a hand on the closest tree and closed my eyes and told myself I could follow the gravel like a blind man follows a wall. When I opened my eyes, the bark had left little black ridges in my palm. I rubbed them away and walked. I had gone maybe a quarter mile when the fog breathed. That's the only way to name it. It drew itself in and let itself out, and the sound that made was not wind moving through needles or water lifting and setting. It was lungs, a pair of them, enormous and slow. The sound came from every direction at once and nowhere. I gripped the strap of my pack until my knuckles ached, and I told myself I would not run. Running invites pursuit. Running is prey talk. I wasn't prey. I was a person on a path. The fog breathed again, closer, and a shape moved inside it. Not a figure, not at first, more like a disturbance, then a suggestion of shoulders, a head. I froze. I couldn't see a face, and that saved me. The thing stopped when I stopped, a shadow among shadows, poised. We regarded each other, me with my breath held, it with its breath too large to hold. Then, softly, it spoke. My name perfectly, not the gurgling imitation from the window. My name in my own voice. I flinched, and it learned from that flinch and found my mother's voice, and said my name again, with that lift at the end she used when she wanted me to come in from the yard. Blood rushed in my ears. I stared at the ground between us, because the ground was plain and safe and honest. The shape tipped its head. The fog nudged my cheek like a damp hand. It took a step. I took one back without meaning to, and my heels slid on gravel. I pinwheeled my arms and did not fall. The shape changed in that moment, quickly, like a fish turning under a surface. It grew longer, or seemed to, and the knot face leaned forward. I kept my eyes on the ground, on the little stones that looked like bits of bone. It took another slow step, and the breath it let out smelled like water that has forgotten where the sun is. I said no, not aloud, inside the bones around my heart, inside the dark behind my eyes. The shape stopped. "Look," it said, not my name, not a song, just that small word, stretched. It wasn't a request. It was an instruction it expected me to obey, the way all things obey gravity. I counted 5 more steps backward, and the shape blurred, and the fog breathed, and the path bent, and I lost the line I'd made in my head, and panic opened me like a door. I turned and ran. Running in fog is a fool's game. You win by accident, and mostly you don't. I tripped on a root and caught myself and tripped again. Branches swiped at my face, friendly needles becoming small knives. I told myself I was still on the path because the ground felt right under my boots, and my body wanted that lie, and I gave it. The breath behind me was measured and amused. It didn't hurry. It knew the forest better than I did. I thought of the tin nailed under the porch rail. Stay unseen, stay alive. I yanked my scarf up over my nose, pulled my hat down low, narrowed my world to the 2 feet of ground in front of me. I wanted to live inside those 2 feet and nowhere else. A darker shape loomed out of the gray. For one bright, foolish second, I thought it was the ranger station. It was a rock, a big one, the kind that looks like a hunched animal about to stand. I banked around it. The fog thinned just enough that I saw the faintest hint of a trail sign nailed to a dead snag, the upper corner of a board, the suggestion of a painted arrow. I angled toward it as if it were a fire and I were freezing. My boot hit a patch of old ice hidden under needles. I went out from under myself and hit the ground so hard my breath left me like a bird startled from a bush. The pack drove the air farther. For a moment there was nothing in me but a black seam. I rolled to my side and a hand touched my cheek. Not a human hand. Cold, webbed, the skin like a mushroom left too long in a bowl. It patted my face twice, not unkindly, as if testing the shape. My eyes were squeezed shut, and I clamped my lids harder until stars bloomed there, frantic. The hand slid along my jaw and found my mouth and pressed my lips, not to hurt me, but to learn me. I made a small noise I did not know I was capable of making. The hand withdrew. A drop of water rolled into my ear and down my neck and burned like ice. The shape breathed. It leaned closer. "Look," it said again, right against my cheek, and whatever was speaking did not have a human mouth. The word came out rounded and soft and wrong and tender, and I understood something cold and particular. Then, everything in the world that has survived a long time has done so by dressing its hunger in love, where we can see it. I turned my face into the dirt and spoke into it. No. The word buried itself. It felt like pushing a seed into loam. The shape made a small, puzzled sound. The hand patted my cheek once more. Then something passed over my head with the slow, companionable weight of a wet towel being laid there. It was trying to cover me the way fog covers everything, and it would have, if my hand hadn't found the journal strap. I don't know why I did what I did next. Later I told myself it was instinct, or madness, or the stubborn piece of me that doesn't like being told what to do. I pulled the journal free, opened it blind, and shoved the pages into my face. I pressed them there hard enough that the paper cut my lip. I made a mask of the words. The hand froze. The breath against my ear turned sharp. The shape shifted, uncertain. The pages whispered under my fingers. I smelled mildew and old pencil and someone else's winter. The thing made a noise like a dropped stone that takes too long to hit water. The hand lifted. The weight over my head went away. The breath receded a little, then hovered, indecisive. I kept the journal pressed to my eyes and nose and mouth and breathed through another man's entries. If it wanted my face, it was going to have to look at someone else's words. That ridiculous trick bought me 3 seconds. It bought me enough to roll onto my knees and push off the ground and run bent in half, the journal still against my face, one eye peeking past the paper to look for the next step. I ran until the pages tore. I ran until the strap broke. I ran until the breath behind me changed from amused to annoyed, and then from annoyed to interested. The fog thinned again, as if to see better, and for a moment the path ahead was a real thing, gravel and trampled moss, and the gray ghost of a painted arrow on a tree. I aimed my whole body at it. A shape moved where the arrow pointed. Human, a man-sized blur in a coat and hat, a lantern in his hand. I should have known better than to be glad. I was stupid with relief. "Hey," I shouted before I remembered. I wasn't supposed to give my voice to anything. The shape turned its head. I couldn't see a face. The lantern flame didn't flicker. It burned as steady as a watch ticking. Every part of me that had learned anything in the last 3 nights shuddered. The hand with the lantern lifted, beckoned, and my feet, traitor feet, took one step. The breath behind me smiled. I felt it in the way the fog warmed a degree. The lantern holder took another step toward me, and there was nothing under it where the ground should have been. The coat didn't move right. It draped and clung like kelp. I ran sideways, off the path, through brush that whipped my legs, and fir saplings that tried to keep me. The lantern slid after me at a speed that had nothing to do with legs. The The breath followed, patient, unhurried, certain the long game belonged to it. I risked a glance and saw, in the steady hard light, not a face, but something smooth where a face should be, a blank that wanted filling. I shoved my own face down behind my collar and hat and scarf and thought of every mask I'd worn in my life. Child, student, worker, son, and tried to wear all of them at once. The forest gave me another rock. I hurled myself behind it and pressed my back to the cold, ignoring the ache. The lantern passed on the far side, slow as a hearse. I held my breath until my lungs went small and panicked. The fog stroked the stone like a hand. The breath paused and then moved away, and in that thin mercy I understood something else the journal hadn't had time to say. The thing in the lake is tired of its own face. It wants ours so it can walk where we walk, but it can't make one. It has to be given one. We give it when we look. We give it when we answer. We give it every time we believe what wants us doesn't mean us harm. I crawled from behind the rock, and the path presented itself again, humble and astonishing as a road in a story. I took it at a walk because I didn't dare run, and I talked into the collar of my coat without making sound, a string of ugly words and uglier prayers to keep my mouth busy so it wouldn't say yes when the breath asked. The fog kept pace. The lantern came and went, like a thought you can't shake, appearing ahead when I'd lost it behind, hovering to my left when I guarded my right. The breath laughed sometimes, not cruelly but delighted at how interesting I was being. The first real tree I recognized made my knees go weak again, a broken top, a lightning scar. I had seen it on the way in and had thought it looked like a finger pointing at the sky to accuse it of something. I touched the scar for proof, and splinters went into my glove. Beyond it, the path dropped, and then lifted, and then opened to a raw, muddy patch of road where tires had once turned when the ground was dry. The world widened, the fog thinned to veils. I saw, far off and a little below, the roof of the ranger station. Relief is as dangerous as panic. I almost called out again. I bit down on my tongue instead. I walked that last distance, like a man crossing ice. He nose is thin. I did not look left or right. I did not scratch my nose. I did not think a single kind thought. The door of the station was closed. The windows were dark. I put my hand on the latch, and the fog leaned against my back with the weight of a friend embracing you from behind and whispering your name into your hair. It said, "Look in the glass. Just look. Just let me see you. Just a little." The door was old and had a pane in it, a rectangle of thick greenish glass that wore the world backwards. I pushed without looking, and the door gave, and the room was dark and smelled like dust and mouse. I shut it and leaned on it, and only then did I look up, because I couldn't help myself once I was in what I thought was safety. A face looked back at me from the glass of a case on the opposite wall. For a second it was mine. For a second it wasn't. The eyes were too round, too pleased. The mouth was a little too soft at the edges. The fog made a hungry noise at the crack of the door. I dropped to the floor and crawled behind the counter and pulled myself into the little space where once a bored ranger had sorted permits. I tucked my head to my knees like I had as a child under a school desk during false alarms. The breath on the other side of the door grew patient again. It had time. It had all the time. It pressed its weight against the wood until the latch squealed. It whispered my name, and then, in a tone so sweet, I almost opened for it. It said I could sleep now. It said it would hold the door. It said I could rest my head against the glass, and it would watch. I don't know how long we stayed like that. The fog moved along the floorboards through the crack under the door, the thin kind that looks like smoke, and when it touched my boot, it retreated as if leather had a memory iron does. I pulled the journal against my face again, what was left of it, a wadded set of pages, damp with my breath, and I breathed through somebody else's account of a long winter, and I did not move, and I did not look. When the sun finally thought to exist again, it did it all at once. Light fell through the windows in a hard white bar. The fog thinned with a noise like cloth torn in a careful hand. The pressure on the door eased. The breath outside the station deepened and grew slow, and the last long exhale went out over the lake, out of the trees, down into the lid, and the fog followed it. The room warmed a degree. A fly that had been dead a year turned to dust in the sudden light and became part of the air. I stood up on legs that didn't want to be mine, and I opened the door. The world beyond was ordinary again. Pine, road, a sky with a bruise fading from it. The lake, down the slope and tucked behind trees, lay like a sheet pulled over a body. No ripple touched it, no bell, no voice. On the porch of the cabin where the ranger signed things was a wooden box of keys. Mine lay on top of it, the tag with its 3 scratched lines dark against the pale lid, as if it had been placed there with care. I left it where it was. What I remember most about the walk out to where my car slept under a coat of needles is the smell. Everything smelled like itself again. Sap smelled like sap, not like a wet mouth. Dirt smelled like dirt, not like breath held against your skin. My own sweat smelled like fear, but not like the lake. The road took me in the way roads do. The trees let me be the size of a person instead of the size of a thought. When I turned the first proper corner, where a boulder the size of a cabin makes the road bend, I paused and looked back once. The fog had gathered on the lake again, just a little, like steam off a pot. It lay flat. It did not climb. The porch of the cabin on the shore at that distance was a dark tooth and a pale gum. I could not see the prints from there. I could not see the crack in the window or the smear. I could only see the idea of a place I had wanted to be alone and a body of water that had wanted company. I stood there long enough that my breath made 3 small ghosts. Then I turned and went. In town, the ranger looked up from his newspaper when I pushed the door. He didn't smile. He didn't ask for the key. Maybe he had already found it on the porch box. Maybe he expected never to see me again and was adjusting the math. I stood there in front of his counter with mud on my boots and paper cuts on my face and more noise inside me than I would ever know where to put, and said, "The lake." He nodded. A whole conversation passed between us in a very short time in which nothing was said aloud. He looked at the chewed corner of the journal, peeking from my pack, and then at my eyes, and he shook his head once, not in pity, but in recognition. "Best not to tell it stories with your mouth," he said finally, his voice the same quiet he had used over the key. "It learns. If you have to talk, talk to iron." I went to the diner. I sat with a cup of coffee and a stack of napkins and drew my face on one of them in a child's hand and folded it and stuck it in my pocket like a ward. The waitress asked if I was staying long, and I told her no, that I had a long drive. She said the lake was pretty this time of year, if you like that sort of thing. I said I didn't think I did. She poured more coffee. She didn't ask which lake. There are a lot of lakes and only one of me. At home, sometimes the shower curtain moves when the window isn't open, just a sigh against plastic. I don't look. Sometimes the kettle finishes boiling and the steam curls a finger over the lip of the spout, a little white hand, and I turn my head so it can't learn me. I hung a spoon on a string from the front door so it taps the wood when the door moves, and I talk into the spoon when I have to say ugly things, which is more often than I used to think. I keep the journal on the highest shelf where I can reach it, and the lake can't. And on nights when I wake and the room is holding its breath, and the glass of the window is a darker black than the rest of the wall, I pull the book down and press it to my face, and breathe through another man's winter until morning. Sometimes I dream a pale shape stands in shallow water and wears my features the way a dead man's clothes hang on a tree. I wake with my hands over my eyes and count my own breaths until they feel like mine again. If you go there, and I hope you do not, Don't let it see your face. Don't speak to it with your mouth. If you must answer at all, answer into iron. If it sings your name, don't sing back. If you leave, leave without looking in glass. And if you stop at the ranger station and he looks at you the way doctors look at patients, let him keep the key. Some doors you don't have to close behind you. They close themselves. The lake is a lid, and lids are for keeping things shut in. The mistake is thinking you are not one of them. Now, on to the next story. If you hear your name in the pine dark, do not answer, even if it sounds like your own voice calling from somewhere you left behind. That's what the woman behind the gas station told me when I first asked for directions to the cabin. Don't answer the woods. Don't whistle back if something whistles first. And if you must sleep there, sleep with a nail in your mouth. She wasn't joking. She had the hard, weather-browned look of someone who had lived with the mountain the way you live with a stubborn animal. She slid my change across the counter and did not meet my eyes for long. The map she drew on my receipt was just a jagged line with a circle and an X and the word ridge. When I asked if there was any cell service, she said sometimes, if the wind shows you mercy. When I asked if anyone else was staying nearby, she said no, not this late in the season, and added, don't throw out salt. The thing likes salt. I laughed then, because a person like me always laughs at that kind of thing. City apartment, microwave dinners, a calendar full of meetings that meant nothing. The trip was supposed to be a reset, a week alone to rewrite everything that had become stale. The cabin was old but not derelict, one of those rentals with 100 good reviews and a dozen tasteful photos that made distance look like privacy. In the pictures, the porch looked like a mouth with a single tooth missing, a porch swing long gone. The ad said wood stove, creek nearby, towering pines, a perfect place to unplug. I had been sleeping badly for months, and I wanted the kind of silence that erases a day. I wanted a night you could pour yourself into and wake up clean. The road up was the kind that closes in behind you. Gravel first, then dirt, then just two ruts curling through ferns and blueberry bushes and half-fallen logs. I watched the signal bars dwindle to one, and then none, and for a minute I was fully the person I had intended to be, someone who isn't frightened by empty space. You know that feeling when you first taste quiet, and it tastes like water after too much coffee. I rolled down the window, and a clerk's bell of cold air rang across my teeth. The pines smelled medicinal and clean. The mountains seemed to breathe. Then I turned the last bend and saw the cabin hunched beneath the trees, smaller than it had seemed online. The wood blackened by weather, the roof bowed like an old shoulder. The creek wasn't a creek so much as a mile of sopping moss that sounded like a whisper when the wind brushed it. The porch had a single chair, and that chair had a blanket folded across it, as if the last person had just stepped inside to get something and would be coming back any minute. A nail hung on a red string above the doorbell. The bell itself wasn't a bell but a triangle of rusted iron with a stick leaned against the wall. Everything I touched had the sticky cold feel of neglect. It wasn't dirty, it was merely waiting. There was a key under a rock, exactly where the rental agency said it would be. I unlocked the door and stepped into a room that had arranged itself around the wood stove, which sat in the corner like a gray animal. There were books on the shelf, field guides, a battered paperback about knots, a local history with a picture of a mill on the cover. There were jars on the mantel, not decorative jars, but canning jars full of salt, each wrapped with a red string like a wristband. There was a row of nails hammered flush along the interior threshold, a line of salt along the windowsills, clumped in places into little teeth. You can imagine how keenly I noticed, and then decided not to take seriously those details. I'm good at selecting what is sensible. I told myself the red string was a country superstition, the salt a winter trick to absorb damp, the nails a quirk of an old carpenter. The only thing I took seriously was the cold, a deep old cold that crawled into my socks as if reading my body like a map. I unpacked a bit because it makes me feel brave. Putting your toothbrush out in a strange place, your sweater on the back of a chair, your book on the nightstand like a flag. I walked through each room and opened curtains and cabinets. The kitchen had a jar of instant coffee and a bag of sugar. The bedroom had a heavy bed with a quilt stitched into swoops and diamonds, and above the headboard an old nail, driven at a slant, with a small length of red string tied to it. There were no family photos, only a framed print of deer in the snow, where the deer were just dark smudges like thumbprints. I had brought a portable recorder, the kind sound people use for ambient noise. I planned to capture some creek sounds, some wind in the pines, something soothing to record and play back over my loud life. I set it on the coffee table like a polite guest. It was late afternoon, and the cold made early plans. I went back outside with firewood stacked under the eaves. I stood for a while, listening to the deep hush of the woods, the sort of hush you don't notice until you stop moving. Then, very faint from the ridge came a whistle. Not a bird sound, but a person sound. 3 notes as simple as water in a glass. I might have answered, I think I did, before I remembered the gas station woman's face and her sentence about not whistling back. It's irresistible, that urge to reflect what you hear, like putting your foot down where you see another's footprint. I bit down on my tongue. The whistle came again, 3 notes, each the same, a child's kind of whistle, like calling a dog. It wasn't a whistle, I knew. I stood very still, an armful of logs against my chest, and I listened to the woods trying to sound like no one was there. Almost I called out hello, one of those bright words that can save humans from themselves, that can make a stranger less dangerous. But the whistle was wrong. It was too even and too slow, and it did not care whether or not I answered. It was not a call to me. It was a call to itself, a phrase in a grammar that didn't include anything as ordinary as a person. I backed up onto the porch. I set the firewood down with more noise than I needed to. The whistle repeated in the same 3 notes and then stopped, as if a clock had run down. Inside, I made a fire badly, and then better. The wood stove took the teeth out of the cold. I heated a can of soup, and it smelled like home, which should have made me happy, but simply made me aware that I was a long way from home. I ate with the spoon scraping the bottom of the bowl, a sound like flint. Then I read the local history. Every county history is an apology, a ledger of who took what from whom. There was a chapter about the old mill and the man who ran it, a short paragraph about people who vanished in winter storms and were found in spring with their boots dry and their throats stained with iron like they'd been eating dimes. A footnote about a long, long time ago when they used to hang bells on their doors in winter because something comes down from the ridge when the temperature drops under a certain number and climbs into chimneys like smoke. The footnote didn't say what number. Around 9, the fire settled into that bass hum that makes a room feel like it's breathing. I turned off the light because the light made the window into a black mirror, my face floating there like a jellyfish, a lamp behind me like a lighthouse. In the dark, the room felt correct, the way a theater feels right when the movie starts. The wind softened, the creek whispered evenly, the wood stove's cheeks glowed. I fell asleep on the couch, I think, and woke to my name being spoken from outside as calmly as if I'd left the door ajar and someone had leaned in to call me for dinner. At first groggy, I thought it was a dream wearing my name like a coat. The voice was familiar, not the voice of someone specific, but the kind of friendly, amused tone that people use on the phone. Oh, there you are. Then it said my name again in the same tone, and I sat up fast so the room tilted. The fire had slumped into black. The windows were sheets of cold iron. There was a slice of moon making a white smudge on the floor. Every hair on my arm stood up and pointed at the door. I didn't move. You always tell yourself you'll move, that if a thing becomes the sort of thing you hear about later, you will respond like a hero, or at least like a person who has read a few stories and knows the rules. Instead, I let the silence expand around my ears, hoping it would lower the voice's volume into silence. It didn't. It said my name 3 times, evenly spaced, as if the speaker were standing at the edge of the trees, counting the white stripes on the porch boards. I reached blindly for the recorder on the table. My fingers found the buttons by nerve memory. A tiny red light woke. I don't know why I did it, except that making a record makes a thing smaller, and in the morning you can point to it and say, "See, it was just a train in the far distance," or a fox screaming like a child, or my mind racking itself the way it likes to. I held my breath and pressed record, and the tiny machine put my fear somewhere outside of me where it could not bite. Then, very carefully, I stood and crossed to the window and very carefully lifted one corner of the curtain. There was nothing at first but pine trunks and the color black, arranged in different densities like fur. Then the black moved and resolved into a person standing at the edge of the clearing, where the trees began, not on the path, but where the needles were unbroken, as if the person had risen out of the earth there. Tall, not as tall as a pine, taller than me. A person length in a dark coat that looked wet, and in one hand a string of something that gleamed once, as the moon passed over it, as if it held a necklace made of many little frozen tongues. It was only a branch, of course, or a lanyard of keys, or a trick of the moon. The shadow lifted its head, and the mouth opened white and round, and the sound that came out wasn't speech, but a whistle, 3 notes tilting up, the same as before. After the whistle, it spoke my name in my own voice, and I did not move because I would not be the person in the cautionary tale who moves now. There is a kind of stillness you can only hold for a very short time before your body does something for you, and I used all of that stillness up, watching the figure lift its free arm and make a small motion like wiping a tear, even though it did not have a face I could see. The motion was so ordinary that it was wrong, the way a doll sitting at the kitchen table would be wrong even if it never moved again. The thing called my name, the way a mother speaks to a child kneeling beneath the table. Then it turned its head toward the porch and lifted the arm with the string of something, and I saw, as cleanly as if it were beneath a lamp, that the string was made of a dozen rusted bells, the kind you tie to a door in winter so you'll know when someone enters. It shook the bells once, not much sound, only a single tinny syllable. Then the figure lowered its arm and sank backward into the trees without turning its body, like smoke that has changed its mind about a chimney. I stayed at the window until the cold slipped into my wrists. Then the cold pressed into my neck. Then the cold began to speak to my teeth. That was how I knew I had become part of the same story the gas station woman had tried to prevent me from entering. I let the curtain fall. I crawled back to the couch as if the floorboards were an animal I did not trust not to flinch. Sleep did not come. Morning did. It slid around the cabin like a thin layer of milk, a light that made the room feel like the inside of a refrigerator. You know that way morning cheapens fright, how shadows become simple, how the details ask you to look at them sensibly. I opened the door, expecting to see footprints in the soft earth of the path, the point of a boot, a heel, the drag of a coat hem. I saw nothing but the scuffed scrawl of my own shoe prints from yesterday. A squirrel barked out a warning and then scampered up a tree it had warned itself about. The bells were gone, or they were simply part of the arm which was gone along with everything else that belonged to night. I did the most normal thing I could think of. I made coffee. I sat with the recorder on the table and pressed play. It hissed, that clean, cheap hiss like rain on a roof. Then faintly the whistle appeared, 3 notes. The machine made them sound mouth close, as if they were being whistled just behind me, as I held the device, as if the recorder had not been capturing at a distance, but had been offered a copy of the sound direct. After the whistle, in a voice that made my belly go strange, my name was spoken, my actual name, and I heard in the syllables my own nervous habits, the way I hold a vowel when I'm thinking fast. And then the voice said, "Open," as if I had an aperture meant for this purpose. I turned it off. My hands were not steady. When I turned it back on, the recorder kept hissing, and behind the hiss I heard, very soft, the sound of something touching glass, as if a finger had been laid on a window and drawn down slowly, the way someone might test the frost. The recorder did not capture that final moment when the figure sank back into the pines. It cut out just before, or else nothing happened at all, except that the sound in the woods had used my fear to echo. I told myself so. I told myself many things in the voice I use when convincing a friend to quit a job. They were reasonable sentences, poorly received. I could have left. I should have, probably. I even put my bag back in the car. The engine turned over with that complainy sound older cars have in the cold, and then quieted into competence. I thought of the hour down the mountain, to the gas station, the same woman at the counter, the same road behind me, unspooling like a made thing becoming unmade. I even put the car in reverse. But I had paid for a week, and the idea of unlearning fear seemed valuable, and embarrassment plays a role in every horror anyone admits. I told myself I would not sleep at night. I would nap when the sun permitted, and walk in the afternoon, and be in the cabin only when there was enough light to see the idea of the thing for what it was, weather and loneliness and mountain breath. I turned the car off and carried my bag back inside. I went about making rituals, the little ones that say I live here. Briefly, I swept the floor with the broom leaning in the corner. I replenished the line of salt on the windowsills where it had clumped. I tied my own red string around my wrist and touched it to the nail above the bed, without knowing why, the way you touch the first stair when you're about to go down to a basement. That afternoon, I followed the creek a while and found the mill from the book, or what remained of it, just two walls standing, the water rushing through, where people once stood with baskets. I stood in the frame of a doorway and looked at the gloom all around, and thought about how many people had ever been alive here, and how few of them could have been buried somewhere official. I thought with an odd little prickle of comfort that it would be a good deal for a monster to make with a village, to ring the bells and take only those who answered. On the way back I found a deer skull hung in a tree with red string. It had been there a long time, jaw unhinged, the teeth like white seeds. Beneath it the ground was flattened, as if something liked to rest there. I could tell myself a person had put it there for a hunter's ritual, or I could tell myself no person I'd ever want to share a room with would do such a thing without thinking of a thing watching. I stood there a while rehearsing those two reasons, like the way you rehearse an argument in the shower. Then I went home to the cabin. Evening came with a kind of carefulness, a little quieter than it had the night before, as if the mountain had noticed me. I didn't light the lamps except the one by the stove. I did not want to make mirrors at any of the windows. I cooked a pan of eggs, and they tasted like a promise from a decent day, and that made me sad enough to laugh. After dishes, I set the recorder on the windowsill beside one of the salt jars and pressed record. A person can trap the quiet and measure it out later when financial anxieties wake them at 4 in the morning. You can close your eyes and let the quiet run into you like warm water. I pictured doing that days from now in my apartment, listening to the creek's whisper, letting it tell me that houses in cities can be hearths and not furnaces. But the recorder did not give me the creek. It gave me the smallest of all possible sounds, a thread of 3 notes and my name. I turned the recorder off. The bells had not rung. The bells, no bells. I realized I had stopped hearing the wind. The world around my small room had become placed under a glass dome. Then, from the porch, my name came again, with a softness you would use on a child in a sickbed. It asked me to unlock and open, please. It said please twice. Nobody I know says please twice, the sort of politeness you put on like an ill-fitting coat. I backed away from the door. I found the iron triangle on the wall where the doorbell should be. I picked up the stick and did not strike it because ringing a bell is a kind of call, and some things come when called. I slept on the bedroom floor that night. I salted the windowsill again and put the nail from the porch above the bed. It felt foolish, but a good kind of foolish, the way wearing a lucky hat feels. The voice did not say my name again, but I heard it some hours later, singing a short song that was not a song, just 3 notes, and then the word open, and then 3 notes, like a brush stroke, and then open again, as if it were trying combinations to see which worked. At dawn, as if nothing had happened, it began to snow, small, unimportant snow, flakes like dandruff, the sort of snow cities shrug off. In the mountains, it has a different effect. The line between familiar and unfamiliar is about 3 inches deep. By noon, the road was a long white thought. I made tea and sat with the history book and the knot manual and found myself tying a slip knot with the red string from one of the jars, because the body practices what it fears. The book fell open to a page where someone had pressed a leaf long ago. Beneath the leaf, in pencil, someone had written, "Don't turn around when it's behind you. It can't forgive faces." I told myself it was a child's prank. I closed the book. I decided to go into the crawl space beneath the cabin to see if something about the foundation made the night sound with mouths. The hatch was under a rug in the bedroom closet. I lifted it and lowered a flashlight and breathed that cold dirt smell you know from basements, full of a sweetness that is also rot. I climbed down, my socks instantly guilty. It was all ordinary. The grit of beams, the old wiring stapled like veins to joists, the stony earth sweating. I crouched there with the flashlight making an oval of noon around my hand, and thought how silly I was for thinking anything else would be here. Then, in the beam, I saw a row of objects along the far wall, carefully arranged on a board like a child's wide, thin shelf. Buttons, buckles, a line of nail heads, a small rusted bell, a key shaped like a fish. Each had a red string tied to it like a tag. One tag had penciled letters that looked like mine, but were not mine. Mouth, teeth, throat's hinge. Ring this one when you wish to be done. I did not touch anything because I didn't know who might be finished by ringing. I slithered backward and climbed up through the hatch and closed it and put the rug back, and then the dresser on top of the rug, and then the bed in front of the dresser and a chair in front of the bed. Not because a chair helps, but because a person needs a story about doing all they can. The snow deepened. The world dimmed. The house seemed to draw the light inside itself as if it were an old swallow. I built a fire that did not catch, and then did. I ate all the eggs. I did not think about ringing the triangle bell. I thought about the nail in my pocket and how nails are promises in metal form, little sentences that say stay. Twilight is when moved, things move. The recorder, when I turned it on, yielded only my own breath. I had to stop breathing to hear anything else, and that is a trick. Fear teaches children, and I was out of practice. Then the thing did a new thing. It did not stand on the edge of the clearing. It came to the porch. I knew because the boards creaked, the long, slow complaint of an old house made to remember weight. The creak moved along the porch and stopped where the missing swing had once hung. It breathed once, not noisy, but you hear a long body breathe, because every rib is a flute. Then my name again, and the word open, and a second word after, feed. That word had never belonged to me. It had the feel of a mouth that would eat words if it could. It said feed, and then my name, and then, gentle as anything, the 3 notes like a lullaby reversed. The door did not shiver because I had locked it twice and leaned the iron triangle against it. The sound came through the wood anyway, and through that sound came an image, sudden and heavy, of the deer skull hung with red string, and then the crawlspace shelf of tagged objects, and then the idea that perhaps you feed it by naming things you are tired of losing, hours, a person, a version of yourself that could sleep. I did not speak. I sat in the chair in the middle of the room with my hands on my knees and thought of everything I have ever given up for the sake of a quiet that didn't last. The boards creaked again. The voice dropped lower. It said my name in the tone the worst part of me uses when I let it. It said I'm so tired. It said you don't have to close your eyes anymore. It said you can look now. This last was mean because of the pencil words in the book. I pictured someone in another winter being told the same and losing the last thing a person owns, which is the choice of what to see and what not to. By then, the night had pressed its face against every window. The salt line looked thin and silly. The fire folded in on itself like a hand. The recorder sat like a little animal under a table, waiting for crumbs. The creature dragged something down the porch boards that made a sound like a zipper closing. It did not rattle the door. It did not test the window. It waited, like an old teacher confident that eventually you would recall the answer and volunteer. When it spoke again, it did what you would expect a thing to do. It used a better version of my mother's voice, only a little better, just enough to make me know what was wrong. It said my name and told me the thing it would have said if she were alive, which she is not. It said, I brought your sweater, sweetheart. You left it in the car. And then the whistle. 3 notes, and then here. Put it on before you catch cold. That was very clever. It built a context for the door opening that would not require my admitting to myself that I had opened the door for a monster. I pictured all the sweaters in all the cars and all the little winter kindnesses that have killed people. I did not move. An hour must have passed then, or 5 minutes, or 100 years, because time in a story like this does not keep its house in good order. At some point I understood that old hunger was sharpening. The thing worked at patience like a craftsman. The worst part of me admired the skill. It sang the notes and said the word open, and then it did something new with the bells. It held them up again and shook them, and this time they made a richer sound, as if they had been fed oil or heat, and beneath the ring I heard first one, and then 3 smaller bells answer in the woods from different directions, like deer lifting their heads when their names are called. Each bell sounded like a location I had not seen in daylight. It made a little map and sound of the places around me where the woods kept their own doors. It will be less frightening if I tell you what it was. The local names are usually the least dramatic names. In the history book it only had a line. Winter caller, they called it, or borrowed mouth. It comes down off the ridge when the snow begins, and it can't forgive faces. It takes what you hand it in the dark. It does not break down doors. It is too old to work at the level of hands. It waits until people become the sort of thing that opens. Sometimes it returns what it takes. Changed, like snow melted into river water, like a bell made of air. Something moved in the ceiling then. A small sound, just settling, but the kind of settling that comes in reply to a question. You will know this, the way an old house answers itself differently when there are people at the windows. I couldn't help it. I looked up. That was all it took to know it had climbed the wall and was on the roof with a restraint that was worse than stomping. The weight deepened, then it shifted, roof to porch to ground without a misstep, a geography of grace. Then the window beside the wood stove fogged as if something exhaled with its mouth very near the glass. Across the fog, a finger drew a straight line down, and then lifted, and then drew another beside it. I could count the lines by the time my breath returned. There were 5 lines, a hand's worth, then a space, then 4 more. It was making a tally, like a prisoner. It had tallied 5 and then 4. It was beginning to count me. I had the triangle in my hand without remembering picking it up. I raised the stick, then set it down again. I thought of the crawlspace shelf, of the bell-tagged ring this one when you wish to be done. I thought of done as a cliff that has a meadow at the bottom. I did not want to go to that meadow, however clean the grass. I looked instead at the stove. It held heat like a memory. Above it hung an iron poker with a curl that had once been decorative. I took it down and put it into the stove until it changed color, a straw gold shading toward red. Then I walked to the window where the tally marks were drying into nothing, and I drew a straight line in the air beside them with the hot iron. Nothing changed. The line was only in my mind. But you should know in a place like this that a mind is a tool, and a tool is a door. I drew 3 lines, then 1, then 3. I whispered not my name, but a different name, the name of the place I grew up, a word that had no business here. I said that word to the iron and touched it to the top of the salt jar. It hissed. The room smelled like pennies. I do not know why that was the right thing, but the firmness of the act was an answer, and the mountain respects answers. Outside, the bells made a smaller sound, one small bell on the edge of the clearing, and then silence that had weight. The fog mark on the window cleared from the edges inward fast, as if a lung had contracted. The porch plank gave a single reluctant sigh. Then, from far off, one of the answering bells trembled and fell to the ground, making a thin, pitiful sound, like a wick drowning. The creature's voice did not say my name. It breathed out a last 3 notes, and the 3rd note cracked like a voice changing when a boy turns. It sounded, if it is not ridiculous to say this, embarrassed. I slept then, not because I felt safe, but because you have to sleep when the story drops you. The fire ate its last. Morning came gray and fast, and the woods tried to be merely woods again, the way a liar tries to be merely quiet. The snow had stopped. The trees wore fleece. I opened the door because a person must sometimes behave as if life were possible. There on the porch, hanging from the railing, was the string of rusted bells. The red string was now white with frost. On the top step, placed carefully in the center, as if by a person wearing mittens, lay the recorder. I did not remember leaving it outside. Its red light was blinking, patient as an eye. I picked it up. I pressed play. The hiss was there, then the 3 notes, then my name, then the word open, then nothing for a long stretch. The hiss changed the way the sound of a room changes when someone you love walks in. After that, another voice, not mine, and not the borrowed mouth either, but an ordinary man's voice, speaking in a low tone, as if there were someone sleeping back in the room. He said steadily, "No." He said, "You may have the bells." He said, "We ring them for you." He said, "You may not have me." Then softer, he said a name I did not know, and after that, a laugh, still softer, and the recorder caught the sound of the laugh becoming a cough, and the cough becoming crows, and then the voice said, "Tell them," and then the hiss became only hiss again. I rewound the recording and listened twice more. I do not know whose voice it was, a predecessor perhaps, someone who had learned to make the story end, and had left me his sentence wrapped around mine. I put the recorder on the mantel beside the salt, and found paper in a drawer, the kind of lined paper you get in a school supply aisle, and wrote down what the gas station woman had told me, and added what I had learned. Do not answer, not even if it is your own voice. Do not whistle back. Keep the bells quiet, and yours quieter. If you must speak, speak a word that does not belong to the mountain. If you must ring something, ring iron that has known the inside of a fire. If it asks a face of you, show it a window. If it asks a name, give it a geography instead. If it leaves you bells, hang them but do not pull, and if they pull themselves, hold your breath and count. If they count 5 and then 4, Be less than 9. I packed at noon. The snow had softened into a sort of slush sorrow. The road would be manageable, the gas station reachable, the world obtainable again. Before I left, I did the thing that you do in such places. I swept and washed and left a few dry sticks by the stove. I put salt in the jars and tied the red strings tighter and hung the rusted bells back on the porch rail where I had found them, though this felt like leaving a dish of milk for something that might decide it is not milk it needs. I wrote the rental agency a note that said simply, "Lovely stay, thank you," and left it on the table. The nail on the red string went back above the door. When I started the car, I checked the mirror for my face and saw not mine but the woods, layered behind me like smoke. I watched the cabin diminish in the rear view and the pines usher me down the mountain like very tall ushers who all turned their heads at once. By the time I reached the gas station, I had half convinced myself that solitude had written the story on my nerves. The woman behind the counter looked at me as if she had been waiting. She said, "You stayed." I said, "Yes." She looked at the bells in my eyes, I think, because she nodded, as if hearing them, and said sometimes it brings its own chain when it's too hungry to drag you. I asked if she had always lived here. She said she had, and that sometimes the snow teaches you a face the mountain can forgive. When I asked her what she meant, she said sometimes the face is a door, sometimes you are the door that stays closed. I am back now where noise is the god, and none of us think of the mountain as anything but a place you go to borrow a view. I sleep some nights. On other nights I hear 3 notes in my radiator, thin and bright, and my name coming from the far end of my own hallway, in my own voice, light as paper, and I lie very still until I can show it my face, which is no face the mountain would forgive or remember. When the whistle is very small, I set the recorder on the windowsill and press record and let the hiss be the river. I keep a nail by my bed, not in my mouth because there is a difference between superstition and respect, and I have learned to live somewhere in the middle. You may ask why I tell you this when the winter is already here, or when it is far away where you live. But you know why. Every story wants to be fed the same thing, a listener who will close their eyes when it is time, and open them when it is not, and keep the bells quiet on the door. If you hear your name now where you lie, like a stitch being drawn, like a zipper closing, let the mountain be far from you. Let your face be a window. Do not answer, even if the voice is mine. The thing has a million mouths and no tongue, and it will make do with whatever mouth is offered. If it asks you to open, show it a door that only opens onto morning. If it counts you, be less than 9. And if it leaves bells tied with red string on your porch tomorrow, hang them but do not ring them. That is how you feed it best. Leave it hungry and real, old as the ridge, patient as the winter, pacing at the edge of the clearing in a coat, wet with breathing. Let it be there. You do not have to open. You do not have to forgive a face. Listen to the quiet. Let the quiet listen back. That is enough to keep a night from rolling you under like a wave. That is enough to turn a whistle back into wind. That is enough to sleep. Thank you for listening. If this story kept you company tonight, consider liking the video and subscribing for more myths, legends, and gentle hauntings. Sleep well, and may the trails you choose lead you safely home.